Wyoming Territory, 1875. The frontier winds of the Bighorn Basin carried whispers of a promise of renewal, of fortune, of adventure, but Quinn Keller had long since learned not to listen to such dangerous enticements. At 26, he had already amassed more wealth than most men would see in 3 lifetimes. His cattle empire stretched across the Wyoming Territory like a kingdom, but he ruled it alone, convinced that solitude was the price of prosperity in these untamed lands. The spring sun cast long shadows across the valley as Quinn rode along the ridge overlooking his primary ranch. 6,000 head of cattle grazed on the lush spring grass below, the product of years of ruthless determination. His buckskin stallion shifted beneath him, sensing his restlessness. From this vantage point, Quinn could see the sprawling ranch house he'd built 3 years prior, a 2-story structure of solid pine with a wide wraparound porch and glass windows imported from St. Louis at considerable expense. Smoke curled from the chimney, but no one waited for him inside except paid hands. A man builds his fortune alone or not at all, Quinn murmured to himself, repeating the mantra his father had drilled into him before consumption had taken him when Quinn was just 17. The old man had been a failed prospector, chasing gold and silver strikes across California and Nevada, dragging his son along on a journey of perpetual disappointment. Quinn had sworn he would succeed where his father had failed, and he had spectacularly so, but at what cost? The ranch foreman, Hank Wilcox, rode up beside him, his weathered face serious beneath the brim of his hat. Telegraph came from Cheyenne, boss. The cattle buyers from Chicago will arrive next week for the spring sale. Quinn nodded. Good, make sure the prime stock is separated and ready for inspection. Already done, Hank hesitated, shifting in his saddle. Also, there's a wagon train stopped about 5 miles east. Looks like they lost some wheels on the crossing at Miller's Creek. They've got women and children with them. Not our concern, Quinn said flatly. They can make their own repairs. Hank's expression remained neutral, though Quinn caught the flicker of disapproval. Thought you should know, seeing as they might come asking for help. Miller's Creek can be treacherous this time of year with the spring melt. Quinn sighed, knowing Hank was right. His ranch was the only established settlement for 40 miles in any direction. Frontier courtesy demanded a certain hospitality, even from those who preferred their solitude. Fine, send Jacobs and 2 men with timber for repairs and some provisions, but make it clear we're not running a charity. They can pay or trade for whatever they need. Hank tipped his hat. Yes, sir. As the foreman rode away, Quinn remained on the ridge, watching the sun begin its descent toward the western peaks. The dying light caught on something in the distance, the white canvas covers of the stranded wagon train. For reasons he couldn't explain, Quinn felt a strange pull toward those distant shapes. He dismissed the feeling immediately. His experience had taught him that entanglements with others, particularly those looking to settle, only led to complications. And Quinn Keller had built his empire by avoiding complications. Wealth or companionship, he reminded himself. The frontier offers one or the other, never both. With that certainty firmly in place, Quinn turned his horse toward home, unaware that his most cherished belief was about to face its greatest challenge. Felicity O'Brien stared at the broken wagon wheel with a mixture of frustration and despair. At 22, she had already endured more loss than most women twice her age. The Kansas farm she'd shared with her husband James had been their dream, until typhoid had swept through their county last autumn. James had been among the first to succumb, leaving her a widow after just 3 years of marriage. Now, standing beside the damaged wagon in the middle of the Wyoming wilderness, Felicity tucked a strand of her long, honey-blonde hair behind her ear and tried to maintain her composure. She wore a simple calico dress in faded blue, practical for traveling but still showing signs of her careful mending. Her gray woolen shawl offered little protection against the chill mountain breeze. "I can try to fix it, Mrs. O'Brien," offered Peter Crawford, a kindly farmer traveling with his family, but were short on good wood. That creek crossing smashed it properly. "Thank you, Mr. Crawford." Felicity managed a smile despite her exhaustion. She had joined the wagon train in Nebraska, seeking a new beginning in the Montana Territory where her cousin had established a millinery shop. The journey had been arduous, testing her resolve daily, but she had persisted, driven by the need to escape the suffocating weight of memories. The wagon master approached, his expression grim beneath his weather-beaten hat. "We've got 3 broken wheels and a split axle. We'll need to make repairs before moving on." "How long will that take?" Felicity asked, dreading the answer. 2, maybe 3 days if we can find suitable timber. He gazed at the surrounding landscape. There's supposed to be a ranch nearby. I'll send riders to see if we can purchase what we need. As dusk fell, the travelers arranged their wagons in a protective circle. Felicity helped prepare the communal meal, taking comfort in the routine task. The orphan Matthew's children, 8-year-old Emma and 6-year-old William, assisted her, having attached themselves to her since Nebraska. Their parents had died of fever just before the journey began, and their grandmother was taking them to an uncle in Oregon. "Will we make it to Oregon, Mrs. O'Brien?" Emma asked as she handed Felicity potatoes to slice. "Of course we will," Felicity assured her, though her own confidence wavered. "This is just a small delay." As the stew simmered over the campfire, the riders returned, accompanied by 3 men from the nearby ranch. "Keller Ranch has offered timber and tools," the wagon master announced, relief evident in his voice. "They'll help with repairs starting tomorrow." For a price, one of the ranch hands added, a stocky man with a no-nonsense demeanor. "Mr. Keller doesn't give handouts, but he's offering fair trade, goods, services, or cash." Felicity's heart sank. She had precious little money remaining after outfitting herself for the journey. What she did have was earmarked for establishing herself once she reached Montana. The thought of begging for charity turned her stomach, but the reality of her situation was becoming clear. Without her wagon repaired, she would be stranded in this wilderness. That night, as the camp settled into uneasy sleep, Felicity sat alone by the dying embers of the fire. The vast Wyoming sky stretched endlessly above, stars scattered across the darkness like diamond dust. In moments like this, the magnitude of her solitude threatened to overwhelm her. "I don't know where I'm going anymore," she whispered to the night, a confession she would never make in daylight. "I'm lost in more ways than I can count." The wind carried her words away, and Felicity drew her shawl tighter around her shoulders. She had learned early in widowhood to keep her vulnerabilities hidden, to present a face of calm capability to the world. But here, with only the stars as witness, she allowed herself a moment of honesty. Tomorrow would require strength again, bartering for repairs, continuing the journey, maintaining her independence in a world that offered little mercy to a woman alone. For tonight, however, she acknowledged the truth. She was adrift in a wilderness both physical and emotional, with no clear path forward. As she finally sought her bedroll, Felicity was unaware that fate was already in motion, drawing her toward a collision course with a man equally adrift, though he had yet to recognize it. Quinn Keller studied the ledgers spread across his desk, the lamplight casting dancing shadows on the polished wood. The ranch house was quiet save for the occasional crack of the fire in the stone hearth. He rubbed his eyes, calculations of profit margins temporarily forgotten as his thoughts drifted to the stranded wagon train. "Damn fools," he muttered, reaching for the glass of whiskey at his elbow. "Crossing Miller's Creek this time of year." A knock at the door interrupted his brooding. "Enter," he called, straightening in his chair. Hank stepped inside, removing his hat. The men returned from the wagon train. "They'll start repairs at first light." "Good, what are they offering in trade?" "Mostly small goods, preserved foods, fabric, some tools. One family has a fine pair of draft horses they're willing to part with." Hank hesitated. "There's a widow traveling alone who doesn't have much to trade. Seems she lost everything in Kansas." Quinn's jaw tightened. "That's not my concern, Hank." "No, sir, it isn't." Hank's tone remained neutral, but his disapproval hung in the air. "Just thought you should know the situation." After the foreman left, Quinn found himself unable to concentrate on the ledgers. He walked to the window, gazing toward the east where the wagon train had made camp, invisible now in the darkness. The widow's predicament nagged at him for reasons he couldn't articulate. "Not my problem," he repeated, but the words rang hollow. Sleep eluded him that night, and by dawn, Quinn had made a decision. He would ride out to the wagon train himself, not out of charity, he insisted to himself, but to ensure the transactions were handled properly. His business acumen had built this empire. He wouldn't allow sentiment to undermine it now. As the sun crested the eastern hills, Quinn rode toward the encampment, accompanied by 2 ranch hands. The morning air carried the promise of warmth, though winter's chill hadn't fully released its grip on the high country. He cut an impressive figure on his buckskin stallion, his dark hair neatly trimmed beneath his hat, his clean-shaven face bronzed from years under the Wyoming sun. Though his clothes were practical, leather chaps over denim trousers, a sturdy cotton shirt, and a well-worn duster, the quality was evident to any discerning eye. The wagon train came into view, a circle of canvas-covered vehicles surrounded by the bustle of morning activity. Children darted between wagons, women tended cooking fires, and men gathered around the damaged vehicles. Quinn's arrival drew immediate attention, conversation faltering as he approached. The wagon master stepped forward to greet him. "Mr. Keller, we're grateful for your assistance." Quinn nodded curtly. "My men tell me you have items to trade. I'd like to see what you're offering." "Of course," the man replied, gesturing toward a wagon where goods had been gathered. "We've pooled what we can spare." Quinn dismounted, handing his reins to one of the ranch hands. As he moved through the camp, he was acutely aware of the stares, some curious, some wary, some plainly hopeful. He kept his expression neutral, the mask of the businessman firmly in place. He was examining a set of German-made tools when he became aware of a presence beside him. Turning, he found himself facing a young woman whose appearance momentarily stole his practiced composure. She stood straight-backed and proud, despite the evident weariness in her eyes. Honey-blonde hair was pulled back in a practical knot, though several strands had escaped to frame a face of striking beauty. Her blue calico dress was travel-worn but neat, her gray shawl clutched tightly around slender shoulders. But it was her eyes that captured Quinn's attention, clear gray eyes that held a depth of experience at odds with her youthful features. "Mr. Keller," she said, her voice steady despite the slight tremor in her hands, "I'm Felicity O'Brien. I understand you're accepting trade for wagon repairs." Quinn found himself momentarily unable to respond, an unfamiliar sensation for a man accustomed to commanding any situation. He cleared his throat. "That's correct, Mrs. O'Brien. I have little to offer in terms of goods," she continued, a flush of color rising to her cheeks, "but I'm skilled with needle and thread. I can mend, alter, or create garments as needed. I also have experience with bookkeeping from helping my late husband with our farm accounts." Quinn studied her, recognizing the painful pride of someone unused to asking for assistance. Something stirred within him, respect perhaps, or recognition of a kindred spirit determined to survive on their own terms. "Your wagon requires significant repairs," he said finally. "The work you're offering wouldn't cover the cost." Her shoulders stiffened, but she held his gaze. "I understand, Mr. Keller. Perhaps we could discuss an installment arrangement. I'm traveling to Montana to join my cousin. Once established, I could send payment." The wagon master approached before Quinn could respond. "Mr. Keller, we've got the timber ready for the first repairs." Quinn nodded absently, his attention still on Felicity O'Brien. Against his better judgment, he found himself intrigued by this young widow who faced her precarious situation with such dignity. "We'll discuss terms later, Mrs. O'Brien," he said. "For now, my men will begin repairs on your wagon along with the others." Relief flickered across her face before she composed herself. "Thank you, Mr. Keller. I don't accept charity, only fair exchange." "Neither do I, Mrs. O'Brien," he replied, surprised by the hint of a smile tugging at his lips. "Neither do I." As Quinn turned to inspect the damaged wagons, he was unsettled by the realization that he wanted to know more about Felicity O'Brien, a dangerous wanting for a man who had built his life on the principle of self-reliance. The frontier had taught him that attachments were liabilities, yet he found himself drawn to this woman who seemed to embody the very determination that had driven his own success. For the first time in years, Quinn Keller's carefully constructed worldview trembled, like the first warning crack in river ice before the spring thaw. The sun climbed higher as the work progressed, men swarming over the damaged wagons with tools and timber. Felicity kept herself busy, helping with the communal lunch preparation while keeping a watchful eye on the Matthews children. All the while, she was acutely aware of Quinn Keller's commanding presence as he moved through the camp, directing his men and inspecting the repairs. She hadn't expected the wealthy rancher to appear in person. The stories she'd heard during their journey painted him as a reclusive figure who ruled his cattle empire through intermediaries. Nothing had prepared her for the reality of the man, tall and broad-shouldered, with a face that combined rugged masculinity with an unexpected refinement. His eyes, a piercing blue-green, seemed to see through pretense, making her feel simultaneously exposed and understood. "He's watching you again," whispered Eleanor Crawford, Peter's wife, as they worked side by side preparing bread dough. "Don't be ridiculous," Felicity replied, though she'd felt his gaze several times throughout the morning. "It's not ridiculous at all," Eleanor insisted. Quinn Keller could have any woman in the territory, but he's remained unmarried. Perhaps he's been waiting for someone worthy of notice. Or perhaps he simply recognizes that I'm the only traveler who hasn't offered adequate payment, Felicity countered, pushing down the treacherous flutter in her stomach. I'm a recent widow heading to Montana, Mrs. Crawford. The last thing I need is romantic nonsense. Eleanor smiled knowingly but said nothing more, leaving Felicity to her thoughts. By mid-afternoon, the heat had become oppressive. Felicity distributed water to the workers, forcing herself to approach Quinn Keller with the same composure she offered the others. "Water, Mr. Keller?" she asked, extending a dipper from the bucket she carried. He straightened from examining a repaired axle, removing his hat to wipe his brow. Without the hat shadowing his features, he looked younger, less severe. A lock of dark hair fell across his forehead, and Felicity found herself fighting an absurd impulse to brush it back. "Thank you, Mrs. O'Brien." He accepted the dipper, his fingers brushing hers momentarily. The brief contact sent an unexpected current through her, disturbing in its intensity. He drank deeply, his throat working, then returned the dipper. "Your wagon should be sound by tomorrow morning. The damage wasn't as severe as initially thought." "That's welcome news," she replied, gathering her composure. "About our arrangement." "Walk with me," he interrupted, gesturing toward the shade of a nearby cottonwood. The request, though courteously phrased, held the unmistakable tone of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Felicity hesitated, aware of the curious glances from others in the camp. Propriety demanded she decline a private conversation with a man she barely knew, yet practical necessity demanded she secure terms for the repairs. After a moment's deliberation, she nodded, setting down the water bucket and following him to the tree, careful to remain within view of the camp. In the dappled shade, Quinn turned to face her. "I understand you're traveling to Montana to join your cousin." "Yes. She owns a millinery shop in Helena and has offered me a position." "A long journey for a woman alone." Felicity lifted her chin. "Necessity doesn't concern itself with convenience, Mr. Keller. After my husband died, remaining in Kansas became untenable." Something flickered in his eyes, recognition, perhaps. The frontier can be unforgiving to those without support. "Yet here you are, thriving in its harshest reaches," she observed. "Your success is well known even beyond Wyoming." A wry smile crossed his features. "Success and happiness aren't always companions, Mrs. O'Brien." The unexpected candor surprised her. Before she could respond, he continued, his tone shifting back to business. "I have a proposal regarding payment for your repairs." He gestured toward the ranch house visible in the distance. "My operation has grown too large for informal bookkeeping. I need someone to organize my accounts properly, particularly with the Chicago cattle buyers arriving next week." Felicity stared at him, comprehension dawning. "You're offering me employment." "Temporary employment," he clarified. 2 weeks of work to settle your debt. My men will complete your wagon repairs today, but instead of continuing with the wagon train tomorrow, you would remain at the ranch until the cattle sale concludes. Afterward, I'll provide transportation to rejoin the train at their next scheduled stop." The offer was unexpected but not unwelcome. Felicity had been secretly dreading the remainder of the journey, the cramped wagon, the dust, the constant vigilance required when traveling through uncertain territory. "What about my belongings?" she asked, practical concerns foremost. "Your wagon can be stored in my barn. You'll have private accommodations in the ranch house with my housekeeper, Mrs. Larson, as chaperone." His expression remained impassive. "The arrangement is purely professional, Mrs. O'Brien." "Of course," she replied quickly, a flush rising to her cheeks. "I never suggested otherwise." For a brief moment, amusement warmed his gaze. "Then we understand each other. Do you accept the terms?" Felicity considered the proposal. 2 weeks in a comfortable house doing work she was skilled at would allow her to regain her strength before continuing to Montana. More importantly, it would discharge her debt honorably. "I accept, Mr. Keller, with gratitude for the opportunity." He nodded once the matter settled. "I'll inform the wagon master of the arrangement. Be ready to depart for the ranch by sundown." As he walked away, Felicity remained in the shade, wondering if she had made a prudent decision or a reckless one. Quinn Keller was an enigma, the wealthy rancher who claimed to value solitude yet offered employment to a stranger. His reputation spoke of a hard man, driven by ambition rather than sentiment, yet she had glimpsed something else beneath the controlled exterior, a flicker of understanding when she spoke of loss, a moment of unguarded honesty about the hollow nature of success without companionship. "You're imagining things," she chided herself. "The man offered you work, not friendship, and certainly nothing more." Still, as she returned to the busy camp to prepare for her unexpected change in plans, Felicity couldn't shake the feeling that she was stepping onto a path that would lead her far from her carefully laid plans. A realization that should have terrified her, but instead stirred a long-dormant sense of anticipation. Quinn rode slightly ahead of the wagon carrying Felicity O'Brien and her modest belongings, acutely aware of her presence behind him. The decision to offer her employment had been impulsive, unlike his usually calculated business moves. He told himself it was merely practical. He did need help with the accounts before the cattle buyers arrived, but honesty forced him to acknowledge a simpler truth: he wasn't ready to watch her leave. The realization disturbed him. Quinn had built his life around the principle that attachment was vulnerability, a lesson learned watching his father chase dreams and women with equal fervor and equal failure. His own success had come through single-minded focus, unencumbered by emotional entanglements. Yet something about Felicity O'Brien's quiet dignity had breached defenses he hadn't realized needed guarding. As they crested the final rise before the ranch spread out before them, Quinn reined in his horse, allowing the wagon to draw alongside. The spring evening painted the valley in gold, the sprawling ranch house catching the last rays of sunlight. Beyond it, the bunkhouses, barns, and corrals formed a small settlement, smoke rising from several chimneys. "Keller Ranch," he said, a hint of pride coloring his voice. 5,000 acres of the best grazing land in the territory. Felicity leaned forward on the wagon seat, her expression one of genuine appreciation. "It's magnificent, Mr. Keller. You've built something remarkable here." "Built it from nothing," he confirmed, unexpected warmth spreading through him at her admiration. "When I arrived 7 years ago, there was only a one-room cabin and 100 head of cattle. Every building you see, I designed and helped construct. Every pasture was cleared by men I hired and trained." "A kingdom of your own making," she observed, her gray eyes meeting his. "Though I imagine it must be lonely at times, ruling alone." The observation, offered without judgment, struck uncomfortably close to truth. Quinn straightened in his saddle. Solitude has its advantages in business. No competing priorities, no divided loyalties. "And its disadvantages in life," she replied softly, then flushed as if regretting the personal nature of the comment. "Forgive me, that was presumptuous." Quinn found himself wanting to pursue the conversation, to ask what she had learned of solitude in her own experience. But they had reached the ranch yard where several hands were finishing their evening chores. He nodded to one of the men to take charge of the wagon. "Mrs. Larson will show you to your accommodations," he said, resuming his role as employer. "We dine at 7. Tomorrow morning I'll show you the account books and explain what needs to be done." "Thank you, Mr. Keller, I look forward to beginning work." Her formal response matched his own, the brief moment of personal connection already fading. Quinn watched as Mrs. Larson, his stalwart housekeeper, greeted Felicity warmly and led her into the house. Only when they had disappeared inside did he dismount and hand his horse to a waiting stable boy. Hank approached, curiosity evident beneath his usual stoic expression. "Saw you brought the widow back with you." "Mrs. O'Brien will be organizing the accounts before the Chicago buyers arrive," Quinn explained, his tone discouraging further inquiry. "She'll be staying for 2 weeks in exchange for her wagon repairs." Hank nodded slowly, sensible arrangement, though it's the first time you've brought a guest to stay at the main house. "Business necessity," Quinn replied curtly, striding toward the house. "Nothing more." But as he entered his home, suddenly aware of the feminine presence disrupting its masculine austerity, Quinn knew he was lying to himself. Whatever had prompted his impulsive offer to Felicity O'Brien, it wasn't business. For the first time since founding his ranch, Quinn Keller had acted against his own cardinal rule: never allow personal feelings to influence business decisions. More troubling still was the realization that he didn't regret it. The bedroom assigned to Felicity surpassed any accommodation she had experienced since leaving her parents' home in Pennsylvania years ago. Spacious and airy, with a large window overlooking the ranch yard, it contained a 4-poster bed with a proper feather mattress, a washstand with porcelain basin, a wardrobe for her few clothes, and even a small writing desk positioned to catch the morning light. Mr. Keller had this room furnished for his sister when she visited last summer, Mrs. Larson explained as she helped Felicity unpack her meager belongings. The housekeeper was a plump, efficient woman in her 50s, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner. First time it's been used since then. The man has built a house big enough for a large family, but he lives in it all alone, save for me and the cook. It's very generous of him to offer it to me, Felicity said, carefully hanging her spare dress in the wardrobe. The contrast between her worn garments and the elegant furnishings made her acutely aware of how far she had fallen from the comfortable middle-class existence she had once known. Mrs. Larson made a sound that might have been agreement or skepticism. Mr. Keller is fair in business, if not overly generous, but he's a good man underneath that stern manner. Lost his mother young, and his father wasn't worth the powder it would take to blow him to kingdom come, from what I hear. Boy raised himself, really. He's accomplished a great deal for someone so young, Felicity observed, arranging her hairbrush and comb on the washstand. 26 years old and richer than most men twice his age, Mrs. Larson confirmed. But money can't warm a man at night, can it? Not that it's my place to say so. Felicity felt heat rise to her cheeks at the housekeeper's implication. Our arrangement is strictly professional, Mrs. Larson. I'm to organize his accounts, nothing more. The older woman's expression softened. Of course, dear, and I'm here as your chaperone, though no one who knows Quinn Keller would think him capable of impropriety. Too controlled for that is our Mr. Keller. She checked the water in the basin. Dinner will be served in the dining room at 7. The bathroom is at the end of the hall if you want to freshen up properly. Mr. Keller had indoor plumbing installed last year, very modern. After Mrs. Larson departed, Felicity sank onto the edge of the bed, overwhelmed by the sudden change in circumstances. Yesterday, she had been just another traveler in the wagon train, anonymous and unremarkable. Today, she found herself the guest of the wealthiest rancher in the territory, a man whose penetrating gaze seemed to see past her careful composure to the uncertainty beneath. The sound of male voices drifted through the partially open window, Quinn speaking with one of his ranch hands about the next day's work. His voice carried the natural authority of a man accustomed to command, but without the harshness she had observed in other self-made men. Despite his reputation for ruthless business dealings, there was something in Quinn Keller that inspired loyalty rather than mere obedience. Felicity rose and moved to close the window, but paused as Quinn came into view below. He had removed his hat, and the evening breeze ruffled his dark hair as he pointed toward the distant pastures, explaining something to the younger man beside him. In that unguarded moment, with the golden light softening his features, he looked less like the formidable rancher and more like a young man bearing responsibilities beyond his years. The thought brought an unexpected pang of sympathy. Felicity recognized the weight of premature responsibility all too well. At 17, she had assumed management of her family home after her mother's death, caring for her father and younger siblings until her marriage at 19. James had been kind and steady, if not passionately loved, offering security and respectability. His death had shattered that security, forcing her once again to shoulder burdens alone. Perhaps that shared experience explained the strange connection she had felt during their brief conversation under the cottonwood, that moment of mutual recognition when Quinn had spoken of success without happiness. The thought that they might have something in common beyond their current business arrangement was both intriguing and unsettling. 2 weeks, she reminded herself firmly, closing the window. 2 weeks of work to discharge your debt, then on to Montana as planned. With that resolution in place, Felicity turned to prepare for dinner, determinedly ignoring the small voice that wondered if 2 weeks might be long enough to discover what lay beneath Quinn Keller's carefully maintained facade, and equally long enough for him to discover the vulnerabilities she worked so hard to conceal. The dining room, like the rest of the house, reflected Quinn's preference for quality without ostentation. The furniture was solid oak, the tableware fine without being fussy, the lighting provided by brass oil lamps that cast a warm glow over the polished surfaces. For the first time in his ownership of the ranch, Quinn found himself seeing the room through the eyes of another, noting the masculine austerity that had never before seemed lacking. He stood as Felicity entered, struck anew by her quiet grace. She had changed into a simple dark green dress, high-necked and long-sleeved as befitted a widow still in half-mourning. Her honey-blonde hair was arranged in a neat coil at the nape of her neck, though a few strands had escaped to soften her features. The simplicity of her appearance only enhanced her natural beauty, a fact that Quinn found himself appreciating more than was strictly appropriate. "Mrs. O'Brien," he greeted her, moving to hold her chair. "I trust your accommodations are satisfactory." "More than satisfactory, Mr. Keller," she replied, taking her seat. "You have a beautiful home." "Functional more than beautiful," he said, returning to his place at the head of the table, "but comfortable enough." Mrs. Larson served the meal: roast beef with vegetables from the kitchen garden, fresh bread still warm from the oven, and berry preserves from last summer's harvest. Quinn was suddenly aware of how rarely he paid attention to the food served in his own home, usually eating quickly before returning to work. "Will you tell me about your ranch operations, Mr. Keller?" Felicity asked after they had begun eating. "If I'm to organize your accounts properly, I should understand the business." Quinn welcomed the practical topic. "We run primarily beef cattle, Herefords and Shorthorns, with some Angus mixed in for hardiness. The spring sale to the Chicago buyers is our largest annual transaction, 3,000 head this year. We also supply beef to the Indian agencies and the military posts throughout the territory." As dinner progressed, Quinn found himself explaining more than the mere facts of his business, sharing his vision for expanding into better breeding stock, the challenges of winter feeding, his experiments with different grasses in the hay meadows. Felicity listened attentively, asking questions that revealed a practical understanding of agricultural economics. "Your husband's farm in Kansas," Quinn said, curiosity getting the better of him. "What did you raise there?" A shadow crossed her face at the mention of her late husband. "Wheat primarily, with some corn and a small orchard. It was modest compared to your operation, but it was beginning to prosper when the typhoid came." "I'm sorry for your loss," Quinn said, the words inadequate but sincere. Felicity nodded, composure restored. "Life on the frontier teaches us that nothing is permanent. We build, knowing that nature or circumstance may destroy our work in an instant." "Yet we continue building," Quinn observed. "What else can we do?" She replied, her gray eyes meeting his directly: "Surrender to the wilderness." The question hung between them, carrying meaning beyond the literal. In that moment, Quinn recognized a kindred spirit, someone who understood the price of survival in these untamed territories, who had faced loss and continued forward not out of blind optimism, but out of stubborn determination. The conversation shifted to safer topics: the upcoming cattle sale, the changes in the territory since Wyoming had received territorial status, the prospects of the transcontinental railroad's impact on ranching. Throughout, Quinn found himself increasingly drawn to Felicity's combination of practical intelligence and genuine feeling, so different from the calculated interactions that characterized most of his business dealings. As Mrs. Larson cleared the dishes and brought coffee, Quinn became aware that this was the longest personal conversation he had engaged in for years. More disturbing still was the realization that he didn't want it to end. "I should retire, Mr. Keller," Felicity said finally, rising from the table. "If I'm to begin work on your accounts tomorrow, I'll need a clear head." Quinn stood immediately. "Of course, I'll show you to the office after breakfast, 8 o'clock if that suits you." "Perfectly," she replied, a hint of a smile softening her features. "Thank you for dinner and for your hospitality." "Good night, Mrs. O'Brien." After she had gone, Quinn remained at the table, turning his coffee cup in his hands. The house seemed different somehow, as if Felicity's presence had altered more than just the seating arrangement at dinner. For the first time since he had built it, the ranch house felt like a home rather than merely headquarters for his business empire. The realization was unsettling for a man who had convinced himself that emotional attachments were incompatible with frontier success. Quinn had long believed that the choice was binary: wealth or companionship, never both. Yet Felicity O'Brien, with her quiet strength and clear-eyed practicality, challenged that belief simply by existing in his space without diminishing it. "Dangerous thinking," he muttered to himself, pushing back from the table. 2 weeks of professional association didn't justify reimagining the principles that had guided his life. Felicity O'Brien would organize his accounts, discharge her debt, and continue to Montana as planned. His life would return to its orderly progression of business decisions and empire building, unencumbered by emotional complications. With that resolution firmly in mind, Quinn retired to his study to review contracts for the upcoming cattle sale, determinedly focusing on business rather than the gray-eyed widow whose presence had somehow made his carefully constructed world feel simultaneously more complete and more precarious than ever before. The office where Quinn conducted his business affairs occupied a corner room on the ground floor of the ranch house, with windows facing east and south to capture the morning light. Like the rest of the house, it reflected its owner's preference for quality and functionality. A massive oak desk dominated the space, flanked by floor-to-ceiling bookshelves containing volumes on cattle breeding, land management, and territorial law. A large safe stood against one wall, while maps of the ranch and surrounding territories hung on another. Felicity stood in the center of the room, taking in the ordered chaos of ledgers, correspondence, and contracts stacked on every available surface. "As you can see," Quinn said from the doorway, "I've outgrown my system of record-keeping." She turned to face him, struck again by his commanding presence. In the morning light, dressed in a clean white shirt and dark trousers, he looked every inch the successful businessman rather than the rugged rancher of yesterday. The contrast was fascinating, a man equally at home in the saddle and behind a desk, straddling the divide between frontier roughness and eastern sophistication. "It appears you need more than 2 weeks of assistance, Mr. Keller," she observed, moving to examine the nearest stack of papers. A hint of a smile crossed his features. "Perhaps, but 2 weeks of your expertise will at least prepare us for the Chicago buyers." He crossed to the desk, indicating the largest ledger. "This contains the basic cattle inventory and sales records, but as you can see, entries have become irregular over the past year as operations expanded." Felicity opened the ledger, quickly assessing the system he had attempted to maintain. The entries were neat and methodical in the earlier pages, becoming increasingly hurried and abbreviated toward the end. "You need separate ledgers for different aspects of the operation," she said, professional interest overcoming her awareness of his proximity as he stood beside her. "One for breeding stock, one for market cattle, one for ranch expenses and improvements. Everything should cross-reference to a master account book." Quinn nodded, clearly impressed. "Exactly what I've been thinking but haven't had time to implement." He hesitated. "How did you learn bookkeeping, Mrs. O'Brien? It's not a common skill for a farmer's wife." "My father was a banker in Pennsylvania," she explained, continuing to examine the records. "He believed his daughters should understand finance as well as his sons. When I married James and moved to Kansas, I kept our farm accounts from the beginning." "A progressive thinker, your father." "Practical more than progressive." He had 5 daughters and only one son, who showed more interest in poetry than banking. Felicity looked up from the ledger, a faint smile softening her features at the memory. "My father used to say that women manage household economies every day. Scaling that knowledge to business is merely a matter of larger numbers." Quinn studied her with newfound respect. A wise man. The territory could use more bankers with that perspective. Their eyes met briefly before Felicity returned her attention to the ledgers, conscious of a flutter in her stomach that had nothing to do with financial records. "I'll need to create a proper chart of accounts before reorganizing the entries. Do you have blank ledger books?" Quinn moved to a cabinet, retrieving several leather-bound volumes with unmarked pages. "Will these suffice?" "Perfectly." She took them, careful that their fingers didn't touch in the exchange. "If you'll provide a complete list of your business activities, I can design an appropriate system." For the next hour, Quinn outlined the scope of his operations. Not just the cattle, but also hay production, timber harvesting from the ranch's mountain sections, horse breeding, and investments in several territorial businesses. As he spoke, Felicity took careful notes, occasionally asking questions that revealed her quick grasp of the complex enterprise he had built. "You've created something truly remarkable, Mr. Keller," she said when he had finished. "Few men twice your age have achieved such diversity in their business interests." Quinn accepted the compliment with a nod, though Felicity noticed a certain tension in his expression. "Building the ranch has been my singular focus since arriving in the territory. Every decision, every investment has served that purpose." At the exclusion of all else, the question slipped out before Felicity could consider its propriety. A shadow crossed his features. "The frontier demands choices, Mrs. O'Brien. I chose business over other considerations." The statement hung between them, laden with unspoken meaning. Felicity recognized the philosophy behind it, the belief that success in this harsh environment required single-minded dedication, unencumbered by emotional attachments. It was a belief she had encountered often since James's death, particularly from well-meaning friends who suggested that remarriage would distract a woman from the practical necessities of survival. "I should begin work," she said, breaking the moment of uncomfortable intimacy. "I wouldn't want to disappoint your Chicago buyers." Quinn seemed relieved at the return to business. "I have ranch matters to attend to this morning, Mrs. Larson will bring you refreshments as needed. We'll discuss your progress at dinner." After he had gone, Felicity turned her attention to the task at hand, grateful for work that required full concentration. The complexity of Quinn's business operations provided welcome distraction from her unsettling awareness of the man himself. His unexpected moments of vulnerability beneath the controlled exterior, the intensity of his gaze when their conversation strayed from safe topics, the unconscious grace with which he moved through spaces he had created through his own vision and determination. As the morning progressed into afternoon, Felicity lost herself in the familiar rhythm of financial organization, finding satisfaction in bringing order to chaos. She created a comprehensive chart of accounts, designed a system for cross-referencing transactions, and began transferring the most recent entries to the new ledgers. The work was absorbing, allowing her to momentarily forget the strange circumstances that had brought her to this place. It was only when Mrs. Larson brought lunch, a tray with sandwiches, fruit, and coffee, that Felicity realized how many hours had passed. She stretched, easing the tension in her shoulders, and moved to the window overlooking the ranch yard. Below, ranch hands moved with purpose between buildings, leading horses, carrying supplies, performing the 100 tasks necessary to maintain the operation. In the distance, beyond the immediate buildings, green pastures stretched toward the foothills where cattle grazed in scattered groups. Beyond those, the mountains rose in majestic silhouette against the clear spring sky. The scene before her represented more than a successful business venture. It was a vision made manifest, a testament to what determination and courage could create in this wilderness. Quinn Keller had built something permanent in a place where permanence was rare, carving order from chaos through sheer force of will. Yet for all its impressive scope, Felicity sensed an emptiness at the center of the enterprise, a hollowness reflected in Quinn's comment about choosing business at the exclusion of all else. The ranch house, for all its solid construction and fine furnishings, lacked the warmth of a true home. The carefully ordered operations, for all their efficiency, served no purpose beyond their own expansion. "What's the point of building a kingdom if you rule it alone?" she murmured, echoing her observation from the previous evening. The question lingered as she returned to her work, casting the neat columns of figures in a different light. Each entry represented not just a business transaction but a choice, resources directed toward expansion rather than comfort, profit rather than connection, wealth accumulation rather than life enrichment. By the time the afternoon light began to fade, Felicity had completed the basic reorganization of Quinn's accounts. The work had given her insight into the man beyond what casual conversation could reveal: his methodical mind, his long-term vision, his willingness to take calculated risks for future gain. The financial records told a story of someone building not just for present success, but for a legacy, though whose benefit that legacy would serve remained unclear. As she closed the final ledger, Felicity realized that her time at Keller Ranch had already altered her perception of the enigmatic rancher. The man who had appeared so formidable and self-contained at their first meeting now seemed more complex, driven not just by ambition, but by some deeper need to prove himself against the wilderness, to create something lasting in a place where most men merely survived. The realization brought an unexpected sense of kinship. Weren't her own plans for Montana similarly motivated, the need to rebuild, to prove her resilience, to create security through her own efforts? Perhaps they weren't so different after all, she and Quinn Keller, both navigating the wilderness of loss and uncertainty, both determined to forge a path forward through sheer force of will. The thought was still with her when she went to prepare for dinner, adding a new dimension to her anticipation of the evening ahead. "The system you've created is excellent," Quinn said, genuinely impressed by Felicity's work. They sat in the office after dinner, reviewing her progress by lamplight. Clear, comprehensive, adaptable as the business grows. "Thank you," she replied, the simple acknowledgement carrying more satisfaction than effusive praise might have. "I've prepared a summary of your cattle inventory by classification, breeding stock, market-ready steers, yearlings, and so forth. The Chicago buyers will appreciate the organization." Quinn nodded, studying the neatly prepared document. In one day, Felicity had accomplished what he had been postponing for months, creating order from the increasingly unwieldy records of his expanding operation. Her efficiency was remarkable, but even more impressive was her intuitive understanding of the business itself. She had grasped not just the mechanics of his record-keeping but the underlying structure of his enterprise, allowing her to design a system that served its particular needs. "You have a talent for this work," he observed. "Your cousin is fortunate to have secured your assistance for her millinery shop." A shadow crossed Felicity's features. "The arrangement is more charity than good fortune, I'm afraid." Clara wrote that she could offer room and board plus a small stipend until the shop becomes more established. "That seems inadequate compensation for someone with your skills," Quinn said, surprised by the protective instinct that rose within him. "Have you considered other opportunities?" Felicity straightened the papers before her, a gesture that seemed more about gathering composure than organizing documents. "Limited options exist for widows without capital, Mr. Keller, particularly those without family connections in the territory. Clara's offer provides security while I determine my next steps." The quiet dignity with which she acknowledged her circumstances stirred something in Quinn, admiration mixed with an unfamiliar urge to offer solutions. He checked the impulse, aware that Felicity O'Brien was not seeking rescue but merely stating facts. "The territories need educated people with business acumen," he said instead. "Banks in particular are expanding as settlement increases. Your background in finance could be valuable." "Perhaps," she agreed, though without much conviction. "For now, I'm grateful for Clara's offer and the opportunity to reach Montana safely." The mention of her departure in less than 2 weeks created an unexpected hollow sensation in Quinn's chest. He pushed the feeling aside, focusing on the ledgers before them. "Tomorrow we should review the breeding program records," he said. "The Chicago buyers are particularly interested in our plans for improving the herd's quality." Their conversation returned to business matters, but as the evening progressed, Quinn found his attention repeatedly drawn to Felicity herself rather than her work. The lamplight caught the golden highlights in her hair, and her gray eyes reflected intelligence and quiet determination as she explained her organizational approach. Her hands, though bearing the calluses of practical work, moved with grace as she indicated entries in the ledgers. More compelling than her physical beauty, however, was the glimpse of her mind in action, quick, perceptive, bringing order to complexity with apparent ease. In his years of building his ranch, Quinn had dealt with countless men of business, from cattle buyers to bankers to territorial officials. Few had demonstrated Felicity's combination of analytical skill and intuitive understanding. When she stifled a yawn, Quinn realized how late the hour had grown. "Forgive me for keeping you working so long after dinner," he said, rising from his chair. "You must be tired after your first day." Felicity smiled, the expression transforming her features from merely beautiful to luminous. "The work is engaging. I hadn't realized how much I missed using my mind this way." The simple admission revealed more than perhaps she intended: the limitations of her life as a frontier farmer's wife, the intellectual isolation that had accompanied her practical partnership with her late husband. Quinn found himself wondering what kind of man James O'Brien had been, whether he had recognized the remarkable qualities of the woman he had married or merely valued her practical contributions to their farm. "Good night, Mr. Keller," Felicity said, gathering her shawl as she prepared to leave. "Shall we continue at the same time tomorrow?" "Actually," Quinn heard himself saying, "I thought you might like to see more of the ranch." "The accounts can wait until afternoon." Surprise flickered across her features, followed by evident pleasure. "I would enjoy that very much, thank you." After she had gone, Quinn remained in the office, troubled by the direction of his thoughts. His offer of a ranch tour had been spontaneous, motivated by a desire to spend time with Felicity beyond their professional interaction. Such an impulse ran counter to the principles that had guided his life for years: the careful separation of business from personal matters, the avoidance of emotional entanglements that might distract from his primary goal of building his empire. Yet he couldn't deny the effect Felicity O'Brien was having on his carefully ordered existence. In just 2 days, her presence had awakened questions long suppressed about the purpose of his wealth, the emptiness of his grand house, the hollowness of success without someone to share it. Her quiet competence challenged his assumption that women were unsuited to frontier life beyond the domestic sphere, while her resilience in the face of loss demonstrated a strength of character that matched his own determination. Most disturbing of all was the realization that for the first time since establishing his ranch, Quinn was thinking beyond the next expansion, the next cattle sale, the next land acquisition. He found himself imagining his home with Felicity's presence as a permanent feature rather than a temporary arrangement. The dining room no longer silent, the empty bedrooms filled with family, the ranch a living legacy rather than merely a business enterprise. Fool's thinking, he muttered, extinguishing the lamp. Felicity O'Brien was bound for Montana, her future plans already determined. Their paths had crossed briefly and would diverge again once her debt was discharged. Any other outcome was mere fantasy, a dangerous distraction from the realities of frontier existence. With that stern reminder, Quinn left the office, closing the door firmly on both the ledgers and the unsettling possibilities they represented. The morning dawned clear and crisp, the spring air carrying the scent of sage and new grass. Felicity dressed with more care than usual, selecting her best day dress, a dark blue cotton with small white dots, its simple lines flattered by the white collar and cuff she had added to refresh its appearance. Her anticipation of the ranch tour felt disproportionate to the occasion, a fact she acknowledged with rueful honesty as she arranged her hair. "He's merely being courteous to a guest," she reminded her reflection. Nothing more. Yet she couldn't dismiss the memory of Quinn's expression when he had made the offer, a moment of unguarded warmth at odds with his usual reserve. Nor could she ignore her own pleased response, the flutter of anticipation that had little to do with professional interest in ranch operations. At breakfast, Quinn outlined their itinerary. "We'll start with the breeding pastures near the house, then ride out to the North Range where the main herd grazes. After lunch at the line cabin, we can visit the hay meadows and return by the eastern boundary." "Ride," Felicity repeated, suddenly anxious. "I haven't been on horseback since I was a girl in Pennsylvania." Quinn's expression softened with understanding. The wagon would be slower and less comfortable over rough terrain. "But I can arrange it if you prefer." "No," she said quickly, unwilling to inconvenience him. "I'm sure I can manage a gentle horse. It's simply been some time." "Thunder is as gentle as they come," Quinn assured her. "My sister rode him during her visit last summer, and she's no horsewoman." As they finished breakfast, Felicity found herself curious about this sister who had warranted a specially furnished bedroom and a gentle horse. Quinn hadn't mentioned family beyond his deceased parents, and she wondered what circumstances had separated siblings in a territory where family connections were especially precious. She didn't have an opportunity to ask as they moved to the stables, where a ranch hand held two saddled horses, Quinn's buckskin stallion and a sturdy bay gelding with a white blaze down his face. "This is Thunder," Quinn said, leading her to the bay. "He's 15 years old and has the temperament of a favorite armchair." The horse regarded Felicity with gentle brown eyes, showing no sign of the spirited unpredictability she remembered from her childhood riding lessons. She stroked his velvet nose, gaining confidence as he leaned into her touch with evident enjoyment. "We're already friends," she said, smiling up at Quinn. Something in his expression made her breath catch, a warmth that transformed his usual reserve into something approaching tenderness. For a moment they stood in mutual silence, the connection between them transcending words. Then Quinn cleared his throat, gesturing to the mounting block. "Shall we begin our tour, Mrs. O'Brien?" The return to formality created a safe distance, allowing Felicity to regain her composure as she mounted the gentle bay. Despite her years away from the saddle, her body remembered the basics, and Thunder's smooth gait made the adjustment easier than anticipated. They rode first through the immediate ranch grounds, Quinn pointing out the various buildings and their functions. The blacksmith shop, the tack room, the grain storage, the bunkhouses where the unmarried ranch hands lived. Beyond these lay the breeding pastures where prize bulls and heifers grazed separately from the main herd. These Hereford bulls were imported from England at considerable expense, Quinn explained as they paused by a fence where massive red and white animals grazed peacefully. "They'll improve the hardiness and meat quality of the entire herd over time." "A long-term investment," Felicity observed. Quinn nodded, pleased by her understanding. "Exactly. Many ranchers focus only on immediate returns. More cattle equals more profit. But quality eventually commands higher prices and requires less land per animal." As they continued riding, the conversation flowed more easily than Felicity had expected. Quinn spoke of his vision for the ranch with evident passion, not just the cattle operation but his experiments with different grasses for hay production, his plans for expanding the horse breeding program, his careful management of water resources in this semi-arid environment. "You think like a man planning for generations," she remarked as they crested a hill overlooking a vast expanse of grassland where hundreds of cattle grazed, "not just for immediate profit." Quinn reined his horse to a stop, his expression thoughtful. I suppose I do, though I've never articulated it that way. He gazed across the landscape he had claimed and transformed. When I first saw this valley, I recognized its potential not just for what it was, but for what it could become. The work I've done, the land improvements, the breeding program, the water management, they're all investments in a future I may not live to see fully realized. Yet you build it anyway, Felicity said softly, moved by the vision he described. Without knowing who will inherit the legacy. Their eyes met, and in that moment, Felicity sensed the fundamental loneliness at the heart of Quinn's empire building. The contradiction of creating a multi-generational enterprise while living a life that precluded family. The realization stirred a profound sadness, not just for Quinn, but for the many men like him who had chosen ambition over connection, only to discover too late the emptiness of wealth without companionship. The moment was broken as Quinn urged his horse forward, leading them down the slope toward the grazing herd. For the next hour, he explained the cattle operation in detail, how the animals were rotated between pastures to prevent overgrazing, how the calving season was managed, how the cattle were selected for market versus breeding. By the time they reached the line cabin for lunch, Felicity had gained a new appreciation for the complexity of Quinn's achievement. The ranch represented not just business acumen, but a profound understanding of the land itself, its rhythms and requirements, its capacity and limitations. Quinn Keller had done more than claim territory. He had entered into relationship with it, reading its character and working with its nature, rather than merely imposing his will upon it. The line cabin proved to be a well-built structure at the junction of two creek valleys, serving as a base for cowboys working the distant pastures. Quinn had arranged for lunch to be left there, cold chicken, bread, cheese, and apple pie, with coffee heating on the small iron stove. "This is quite civilized for a frontier outpost," Felicity remarked as Quinn held the cabin door for her. "I believe in treating my men well," he replied. "Comfortable line cabins, good food, fair wages, they're investments that pay dividends in loyalty and quality work." As they ate at the rough-hewn table, Felicity found herself increasingly drawn to the man behind the successful rancher. Quinn spoke of his early days in the territory, arriving with nothing but determination and the lessons learned watching his father's failures, working first as a cowhand, then a foreman, saving every dollar toward his dream of owning land. "I bought my first 100 acres and that 100 head of cattle with every cent I had," he recalled, his expression distant with memory. "Lived in a one-room cabin with a dirt floor that first winter. Nearly froze to death when a blizzard hit in November, earlier than anyone expected." "How did you survive?" Felicity asked, caught up in his story. A smile touched his lips. "Old Jacob Blackstone, he was running sheep on the adjacent property, found me half frozen trying to save my cattle and dragged me back to his cabin. Kept me alive for 3 days until the storm passed, then helped me round up what was left of my herd." The smile faded. "He's gone now, but I named that North Ridge Blackstone Ridge in his memory." The simple tribute revealed more about Quinn's character than any business success. Despite his stated belief in solitary achievement, his story contained instances of connection. The old shepherd's life-saving intervention, the loyalty of hands who had stayed through difficult years, the sister who visited occasionally. Quinn Keller might believe himself isolated by choice, but ties of human relationship had shaped his journey nonetheless. As they finished lunch and prepared to continue their tour, Felicity found herself wondering what might be possible if Quinn recognized the value of these connections, if he could see that his achievement had been supported, not hindered, by human bonds. The thought accompanied her as they rode through the afternoon, visiting hay meadows where innovative irrigation systems increased production, boundary lines marked by sturdy fences, and finally, the eastern pastures where this year's calves frolicked alongside their mothers. Throughout, Quinn demonstrated not just knowledge but genuine care for his land and animals. He stopped to examine a calf that seemed slightly lethargic, dismounting to check a section of fence that showed signs of weakness, paused by a creek to assess water flow with the expertise of an engineer. His attention to detail, his evident connection to every aspect of his domain, spoke of a depth of commitment beyond mere ownership. By the time they turned toward home, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the grass, Felicity had received far more than a tour of ranch operations. She had glimpsed the soul of the man who had created this empire, his vision and determination, yes, but also his capacity for care, his appreciation for beauty, his instinctive understanding of stewardship rather than mere possession. "Thank you for today," she said as they crested the final rise before the ranch house came into view. I understand now why you've succeeded where others have failed. This isn't just a business to you, it's a calling." Quinn looked startled, as if she had articulated something he had never fully acknowledged to himself. "I've never thought of it that way," he admitted, "but perhaps you're right." They rode the rest of the way in companionable silence, the connection between them deepening beyond words. As they dismounted at the stables, Quinn helped her down, his hands strong at her waist, lingering perhaps a moment longer than necessary. The brief contact sent warmth spreading through Felicity, a response she hadn't experienced since before James's illness. "I should review those breeding records before dinner," she said, stepping back to a proper distance, flustered by her reaction. Quinn nodded, his expression carefully composed though something flickered in his eyes, awareness perhaps of the same current that had unsettled her. "Of course, I have matters to discuss with the foreman. Shall we meet in the office at 7? "Perfect," Felicity replied, grateful for the return to professional interaction. Yet as she walked to the house, she knew that something fundamental had shifted between them during this day together. The careful boundaries she had established, widow and employer, temporary employee and ranch owner, travelers whose paths had crossed briefly, had begun to blur, revealing possibilities both exhilarating and frightening. 2 weeks, she reminded herself once more as she entered the house. Just 2 weeks, then on to Montana as planned. But for the first time since arriving at Keller Ranch, the thought of departure brought no sense of resolution, only an aching awareness of what and whom she would be leaving behind. Over the next several days, a routine developed that felt surprisingly natural. Mornings were dedicated to ranch activities, riding with Quinn to various operations, observing the preparations for the cattle buyer's visit, learning the rhythms of this vast enterprise. Afternoons found Felicity in the office, organizing accounts and preparing documents, while evenings often extended into conversations that strayed far beyond business matters. Each day, the connection between them deepened, built on shared intellectual interests and mutual respect rather than mere attraction. Quinn found himself increasingly impressed by Felicity's quick grasp of complex issues, her practical suggestions for ranch improvements, her ability to see connections between seemingly unrelated aspects of the operation. For her part, Felicity discovered layers to Quinn's character that belied his reputation as a cold businessman, his dry humor that emerged when relaxed, his genuine concern for his workers' welfare, his reverence for the land he had claimed. On the 5th day after her arrival, they rode to a distant corner of the ranch where a natural hot spring bubbled from the earth, creating a small oasis of lush vegetation in the otherwise semi-arid landscape. Steam rose from the pool into the cool spring air, creating an otherworldly effect enhanced by the afternoon sunlight filtering through the surrounding cottonwoods. "This is magnificent," Felicity breathed as they dismounted, approaching the pool's edge. "Does anyone use it?" "The local tribes considered it sacred ground," Quinn explained, leading the horses to a grassy spot where they could graze. "When I purchased this section from the government, the Indian agent told me their stories about healing properties in the waters. I've preserved it as I found it out of respect for that history." The revelation surprised Felicity. Most settlers she had encountered showed little regard for indigenous beliefs or traditions, viewing them as superstitious obstacles to progress. Quinn's respect for the site's cultural significance suggested a deeper understanding of stewardship than mere legal ownership. "You're an unusual man, Quinn Keller," she said, the use of his first name slipping out naturally in the intimacy of the moment. He looked startled, then pleased by the informal address. "How so, Felicity?" he returned, the sound of her name on his lips sending an unexpected thrill through her. Most men would have seen this as merely another resource to exploit, divert the water for irrigation perhaps, or create a bathing facility for the ranch hands. She gestured toward the undisturbed beauty of the site. "But you've left it intact, honoring a tradition that brings you no practical benefit." Quinn was silent for a long moment, gazing at the steaming waters. "My father would have seen only the practical use," he said finally. He viewed the land solely as something to extract value from: gold from the streams, timber from the forests, grass for cattle. He never understood that the land itself has integrity apart from human use. "And you do," Felicity prompted gently, sensing they had reached something fundamental in Quinn's worldview. "I've come to," he acknowledged, "not all at once but gradually as the ranch has grown." He turned to face her, his expression more open than she had yet seen it. "There's a satisfaction in working with the land's nature rather than against it, finding the right grasses for each soil type, the right cattle for the climate, the right balance between use and restoration. It's a partnership of sorts. The insight revealed a depth of character that moved Felicity profoundly. Quinn Keller might present himself as a hard-headed businessman, but his relationship with his land was founded on respect rather than mere exploitation, a philosophy that extended to his treatment of workers, animals, and ultimately to his own definition of success. They settled on a fallen log near the pool, comfortable now in each other's company. The conversation flowed easily between them, touching on childhoods in different worlds, Felicity's in orderly Pennsylvania, Quinn's in the chaotic mining camps of Nevada, and the paths that had led them to this present moment. "Tell me about your sister," Felicity said, recalling the bedroom prepared for a visitor who never seemed to arrive. "Does she live far from here?" A shadow crossed Quinn's features. "Elizabeth lives in Boston with her husband, a banker she met when attending school there. I sent her east for education when I'd made enough money, wanting her to have opportunities beyond frontier life." He paused, his expression growing distant. "She returns each summer for a brief visit, but this isn't her world anymore. She finds it primitive, uncomfortable." The admission held a note of loss that Felicity understood immediately. The price of Quinn's success had included separation from his only family. In providing his sister with opportunities beyond the frontier, he had essentially guaranteed his own continued solitude. "And your family?" Quinn asked, clearly preferring to shift attention from his own circumstances. "You mentioned your father was a banker and that you had siblings." "4 sisters and a brother," Felicity confirmed. "All still in Pennsylvania except for my youngest sister, who married a minister in Ohio. My father passed 3 years ago, but my mother remains in the family home with my brother and his wife." "Yet you chose to come west with your husband," Quinn observed. "That must have been difficult, leaving such a close family." Felicity nodded, memories of that departure still vivid. "It was James's dream to farm his own land, to build something from nothing. Kansas was offering homesteads, and the opportunity seemed providential." She smiled faintly at the recollection of their youthful optimism. "We were so certain of success, as if determination alone could guarantee it." "It often can," Quinn said, "but not against disease or natural disaster." "No," she agreed softly. "Not against typhoid that sweeps through a community like wildfire, taking the strong as readily as the weak." The pain of those days returned, the helplessness of watching James decline despite her desperate nursing, the terrible silence of the farm after his passing, the gradual recognition that she could not maintain their dream alone. Quinn's hand covered hers where it rested on the log between them, the gesture offering comfort without words. The simple touch conveyed understanding beyond sympathy, the recognition of shared experience despite different circumstances. They sat thus for several moments, connected in a way that transcended the brief duration of their acquaintance. "We should head back," Quinn said finally, reluctance evident in his tone. "The light will be failing soon." As they rode toward the ranch house, side by side in the golden late afternoon, Felicity was acutely aware of the shifting nature of their relationship. What had begun as a pragmatic arrangement between employer and temporary employee had evolved into something far more complex. A connection based on mutual recognition of kindred spirits, despite outward differences in circumstances and position. More troubling was her growing awareness that her plans for Montana had lost their hold on her imagination. The future she had carefully constructed, working in Clara's shop, gradually establishing independence, perhaps eventually opening her own small business, now seemed pale and insubstantial compared to the vibrant reality of life at Keller Ranch. The thought of leaving in just over a week created an ache that had nothing to do with professional opportunity and everything to do with the man riding beside her. Dangerous thoughts, she chided herself silently. Quinn had offered employment, not courtship. His kindness and growing friendship didn't indicate romantic interest, and reading more into their connection would only lead to disappointment. Yet as they reached the ranch yard and Quinn helped her dismount, his hands lingering at her waist, their eyes meeting in a moment of silent communication, Felicity couldn't dismiss the possibility that perhaps, just perhaps, Quinn Keller was experiencing the same unsettling awareness of potential beyond their stated arrangement. The thought accompanied her as she prepared for dinner, a dangerous hope she neither fully embraced nor entirely rejected, hovering at the edges of her carefully maintained practicality like the promise of spring after a long winter. The Chicago cattle buyers were due to arrive the following day, and the ranch buzzed with preparation. Cowboys drove selected cattle into viewing pastures near the house, the cook prepared for additional guests, and ranch hands ensured every building and fence was in optimal condition. In the midst of this activity, Quinn found himself distracted, his thoughts repeatedly turning to Felicity rather than the important business ahead. Their day at the hot springs had altered something fundamental in their relationship, moving beyond the careful boundaries of employer and employee into territory both promising and unsettling. The simple act of using first names had broken an invisible barrier, creating an intimacy that extended beyond their professional interaction. More disturbing was the realization that he had revealed more of himself to Felicity in their brief acquaintance than to anyone else in his adult life, not just facts about his business or history, but deeper truths about his values and vision. Her perception of his relationship with the land as a calling had articulated something he had felt but never named, offering a framework that transformed his understanding of his own achievement. As Quinn reviewed the sale documents in his office, he found himself calculating the profits not in terms of expansion opportunities, but in relation to potential futures that included Felicity. The thought was simultaneously exhilarating and terrifying, a challenge to the philosophy that had guided him for years. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Enter," he called, straightening in his chair. Hank appeared, hat in hand. "Telegraph from Cheyenne, boss. The buyers will arrive on tomorrow's afternoon stage as planned." "Good, make sure their rooms at the ranch house are prepared, and tell the cook to plan for 3 additional guests at dinner tomorrow evening." Quinn hesitated, then added, "And have my private stock of bourbon brought up from the cellar. Mr. Davidson appreciates good whiskey." As Hank turned to leave, Quinn added, "Has Mrs. O'Brien returned from her ride?" "Just now," the foreman replied, a knowing expression crossing his weathered features. "She's in the garden with Mrs. Larson looking at the spring plantings." After Hank departed, Quinn found himself drawn to the window overlooking the kitchen garden, where Felicity and his housekeeper were examining the newly sprouting vegetables. The sight of her animated in conversation, her honey-blonde hair catching the sunlight, her simple blue dress practical yet somehow elegant, created a tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with business concerns. In less than a week, this remarkable woman had transformed his perception of his own home, making him aware of both its comforts and its emptiness. The house he had built with such pride now seemed incomplete without her presence, her voice in conversation over dinner, her laughter echoing down the hallway, her intelligence enlivening discussions that had previously been restricted to practical ranch matters. The realization forced Quinn to confront the hollow center of his achievement, an empire built for a future without heirs, comfort without companionship, wealth without purpose beyond its own accumulation. For years, he had convinced himself that this was the necessary price of frontier success, that emotional attachments would only distract from his vision. Now, watching Felicity in his garden, Quinn found that certainty crumbling. What if the choice wasn't binary, wealth or companionship, success or connection? What if the true achievement would be building a life that encompassed both? The possibility both attracted and terrified him. Practical considerations arose immediately. Felicity was bound for Montana, committed to joining her cousin. Her work at the ranch was temporary, a means of discharging debt rather than building a future. She had given no indication that her plans had changed, no suggestion that she might consider remaining in Wyoming. More fundamentally, Quinn questioned his own capacity for the vulnerability that real connection would require. He had constructed his life around self-reliance, priding himself on needing no one. Opening himself to the possibility of love meant risking rejection, disappointment, loss, emotions he had carefully avoided since his father's failures had taught him the danger of misplaced hope. "You're getting ahead of yourself," he muttered, turning back to his desk. A week's acquaintance, however meaningful, didn't justify reimagining his entire future. The cattle sale demanded his full attention now. Personal considerations could wait until business was concluded. With that resolution firmly in mind, Quinn returned to the sale documents, determinedly focusing on figures rather than feelings. Yet as the afternoon progressed, his thoughts repeatedly strayed to the garden and the woman who had, without intention or artifice, made him question the foundations of his carefully constructed life. "You've transformed the ledgers entirely," Quinn said, genuine admiration in his voice as he and Felicity reviewed the completed accounts that evening. "Davidson will be impressed. He appreciates thoroughness and clarity in business matters." "The system should be easy to maintain going forward," Felicity replied, pleased by his approval yet oddly melancholy at the reminder that her work was nearly complete. "I've prepared instructions for whoever handles the accounts after I've gone." The reference to her departure hung between them, neither acknowledging the unspoken question it raised. Instead, Quinn turned to the cattle inventory, reviewing the categories and counts one final time before tomorrow's negotiations. 3,000 head ready for sale, he confirmed, with an asking price of $34 per head for prime steers, $28 for the secondary group. If Davidson agrees to the full lot at those prices, it will be the largest single transaction in the ranch's history. "And the proceeds?" Felicity asked. "Will they go toward the expansion you mentioned, the additional 10,000 acres to the north?" Quinn hesitated, realizing that his priorities had shifted subtly over the past week. "Some will," he acknowledged, "but I'm also considering improvements to the existing operation, better housing for married hands, perhaps a school for their children. The community is growing and we need to grow with it." Felicity looked surprised, then pleased by this adjustment to his previously single-minded focus on expansion. "That's forward thinking. A stable workforce with families invested in the area will serve the ranch better long-term than transient cowboys." "My thoughts exactly," Quinn agreed, though the shift in perspective had been influenced more by Felicity's presence than by strategic planning. Seeing the ranch through her eyes had heightened his awareness of its human elements, not just the land and animals, but the community forming around his enterprise. As they continued reviewing the documents, their hands occasionally brushed across the ledgers, each brief contact sending awareness coursing through Quinn. The office seemed smaller somehow, the air charged with unspoken possibilities. When Felicity leaned close to indicate a particular entry, her scent, soap and lavender and something uniquely her, momentarily overwhelmed his concentration on business matters. "I think everything is in order for tomorrow," he said finally, moving to create safer distance between them. "The buyers will be impressed with your organizational skills." "Your operation would impress them regardless," Felicity replied, gathering the scattered papers into neat piles. "The ledgers merely reflect what you've built through your own vision and determination." Her praise, offered without flattery or calculation, affected Quinn more deeply than the admiration of business associates ever had. Felicity's appreciation stemmed from genuine understanding of what his achievement represented, not just financial success, but the manifestation of a dream pursued against significant odds. "Thank you," he said simply, the words inadequate for the complex emotions her recognition stirred in him. Felicity met his gaze, something vulnerable and questioning in her gray eyes. For a moment, Quinn thought she might speak to the growing connection between them, addressing directly what had remained implicit in their interactions. The possibility both thrilled and terrified him, leaving him poised between hope and fear. Instead, she gathered the last of the documents, her professional composure reasserting itself. "I should retire," she said. "Tomorrow will be busy with the buyer's arrival, and you'll need these ledgers presented perfectly." "Of course," Quinn agreed, simultaneously relieved and disappointed by the return to practical matters. "Rest well, Felicity." She paused at the door, looking back with an expression he couldn't fully interpret. Regret mixed with restraint, perhaps, or resignation tempered by unspoken possibility. "Good night, Quinn," she replied softly, and then she was gone, leaving him alone in the office with ledgers that suddenly seemed far less significant than the woman who had organized them. Quinn remained at his desk long after she had departed, staring at the closed door through which she had vanished. The ranch house felt different with her presence, warmer, more alive, infused with purpose beyond mere shelter or business headquarters. The thought of its return to emptiness after her departure created a hollowness in his chest that no business success could fill. 7 more days, he murmured, calculating the time remaining before she would leave for Montana. 7 days to determine whether the connection between them justified challenging her established plans. 7 days to decide if he was willing to risk the vulnerability of offering more than employment. 7 days to imagine a future different from the solitary path he had long assumed was the price of his frontier achievement. The prospect was simultaneously exhilarating and terrifying, a fork in the trail of his life as significant as his original decision to claim land in Wyoming Territory. For a man accustomed to calculating risks in business, this personal uncertainty was unfamiliar territory, more challenging than any wilderness he had yet faced. With no resolution in sight, Quinn finally extinguished the lamp and retired to his room, though sleep proved elusive as thoughts of Felicity, and the rapidly diminishing time before her departure occupied his mind long into the night. The arrival of the Chicago buyers transformed the quiet routine of the ranch house into a flurry of business activity. Samuel Davidson, the lead buyer, was a corpulent man in his 50s with shrewd eyes that missed nothing and a jovial manner that disguised a razor-sharp business mind. His two associates, Henderson, a thin, nervous man who handled the financial arrangements, and Young, a former rancher who assessed the cattle's quality, completed the delegation that would determine the success of Quinn's spring sale. Felicity found herself both observer and participant in the proceedings, presenting the reorganized accounts when requested and noting the buyer's reactions to the impressive order she had created from Quinn's previously chaotic records. Davidson, in particular, seemed impressed by the comprehensive system, commenting favorably on the clear categorization of breeding stock versus market cattle. "You've become quite sophisticated in your operation, Keller," he remarked as they reviewed the inventory in the office. "Last year's records were functional but basic. This system rivals anything I've seen from established eastern ranches." Quinn acknowledged the compliment with a nod. "Mrs. O'Brien deserves the credit for the reorganization. She has a background in banking and has brought that expertise to our accounts." Davidson turned his appraising gaze to Felicity, reassessing her presence in light of this information. "Excellent work, Mrs. O'Brien. Are you a permanent addition to Keller Ranch?" The innocent question created immediate tension in the room. Felicity felt Quinn's attention focus on her, though he maintained his outward composure. "I'm assisting temporarily," she replied, keeping her tone professionally neutral. "My ultimate destination is Montana, where my cousin owns a millinery shop." "A pity," Davidson said, returning to the ledgers. "Keller could use someone with your financial acumen as his operation expands." The observation lingered in the air as they continued reviewing the documents, Quinn outlining his breeding program and projected growth over the next 5 years. Throughout, Felicity was acutely aware of the undercurrents beneath the business discussion, Quinn's careful attention to her reactions, Davidson's occasional speculative glances between them, the unspoken question of her future plans hanging in the atmosphere like the promise of approaching weather. When the men departed to inspect the cattle, Felicity remained in the office, organizing the documents they had reviewed and preparing additional information that might be needed during negotiations. The solitude allowed her to confront the uncomfortable reality that Davidson's casual question had forced into the open, her imminent departure, and the increasing reluctance she felt about it. The past week at Keller Ranch had altered her perception of her future. The work she had done here satisfied her in ways she had nearly forgotten were possible, using her mind for complex problem-solving, contributing meaningfully to an enterprise she respected, feeling valued for abilities beyond domestic skills. More significantly, her growing connection with Quinn had awakened emotions she had believed dormant since James's death, not just physical attraction, though that was undeniably present, but deeper feelings of intellectual kinship and mutual understanding. Yet neither of them had spoken directly about these developing feelings or what they might mean for her plans. Quinn had offered employment, not courtship. His evident appreciation of her abilities and enjoyment of her company didn't necessarily indicate deeper intentions. And even if his feelings matched her own, what then? Abandoning her plans for Montana would make her dependent on Quinn's continued goodwill, a vulnerable position she had sworn never to occupy again after the precariousness of widowhood. "Mrs. O'Brien." Felicity started at Mrs. Larson's voice from the doorway. "Yes." "Mr. Keller asks if you would join them at the viewing pasture. Mr. Davidson has questions about the categorization in the ledgers." "Of course," Felicity replied, gathering the relevant documents. "I'll go immediately." The viewing pasture lay a short walk from the house, a carefully maintained enclosure where select cattle had been gathered for the buyer's inspection. As Felicity approached, she saw Quinn and the 3 Chicago men standing at the fence, engaged in serious discussion. Quinn spotted her first, his expression warming momentarily before returning to business composure. "Mrs. O'Brien," he called, "Mr. Davidson has questions about the yearling inventory." For the next hour, Felicity found herself fully engaged in the business negotiations, explaining the accounting system she had created and answering detailed questions about how various categories of cattle were tracked from birth to sale. Davidson's initial approval of her work deepened as he recognized the thoroughness of her approach, while his associates made frequent notes based on her explanations. Throughout, Felicity was conscious of Quinn's presence beside her, his evident pride in her capabilities adding a personal dimension to the professional interaction. Several times during her explanations, she caught him watching her with an expression that went beyond business appreciation, stirring hopes she dared not fully acknowledge. As the afternoon progressed, the negotiations moved from inspection to valuation, with Davidson and Quinn engaging in the intricate dance of price discussion. Felicity observed with fascination as Quinn demonstrated mastery of this aspect of his business, firm on his core valuation, flexible on secondary points, always guiding the conversation toward his desired outcome without appearing to dominate. By the time they returned to the house for dinner, the broad outlines of a deal had been established, with final details to be settled over evening drinks. Felicity excused herself to change for dinner, her mind filled with the complex interplay of business and personal considerations that had characterized the afternoon. In her room, as she changed into her best evening dress, a deep burgundy with modest lace trim at collar and cuffs, Felicity confronted the reality that her time at Keller Ranch was rapidly concluding. The cattle sale would finalize tomorrow or the next day, and her work reorganizing the accounts was essentially complete. Within days, she would depart for Montana as planned, leaving behind not just the ranch but the man whose presence in her life had become increasingly significant. The thought brought an unexpected surge of grief, as if she were contemplating the loss of something precious before fully possessing it. In just over a week, Quinn Keller had moved from stranger to employer to friend to. Something more complex, a potential she could neither fully articulate nor easily dismiss. Foolish thinking, she murmured to her reflection, echoing Quinn's own frequent self-admonishment. Her future lay in Montana, in the practical security of her cousin's offer. Any other possibility required words that had not been spoken, commitments that had not been made, certainties that did not exist. With that reminder firmly in mind, Felicity completed her preparations and descended to the dining room, where business would once again take precedence over personal considerations, at least for the evening ahead. Dinner with the Chicago buyers proceeded smoothly, the conversation flowing between cattle prices, territorial politics, and developments back east that might influence the beef market. Quinn played his role as host with practiced ease, guiding discussion toward topics advantageous to his position while ensuring his guests felt appropriately welcomed. Yet throughout the meal, his awareness of Felicity's presence at the table created an undercurrent that complicated his usual business focus. She participated in the conversation when addressed directly, offering intelligent observations that impressed Davidson and his colleagues, but otherwise maintained a quiet dignity that contrasted with the men's more expansive manner. In her burgundy dress, with her honey-blonde hair arranged more formally than her usual practical style, she brought a feminine elegance to the dining room that had been conspicuously absent since Quinn had built the house. The sight of her at the opposite end of the table stirred visions of a possible future, one where such evenings were commonplace rather than exceptional, where the ranch house fulfilled its potential as a true home rather than merely a business headquarters. As the meal concluded and Mrs. Larson served coffee, Davidson turned his attention to Felicity more directly. "Mrs. O'Brien, Quinn tells me you're a recent widow planning to join family in Montana. May I ask what position awaits you there?" The personal question, though courteously phrased, nonetheless created immediate tension. Quinn noticed Felicity's slight stiffening before she composed her response. "My cousin owns a millinery shop in Helena," she explained. "She has offered me a position assisting with both the creative and business aspects of her establishment." Davidson nodded thoughtfully, a respectable arrangement, certainly. "Though having seen your financial acumen firsthand, I might suggest that a territorial bank would value your skills more appropriately." He glanced at Quinn. "Or perhaps there are opportunities closer to hand that would better utilize your capabilities." The implied suggestion hung in the air, creating a moment of uncomfortable silence. Quinn felt a surge of irritation at Davidson's presumption, though the man had merely articulated what Quinn himself had been considering. "Mrs. O'Brien's plans are her own affair," Quinn said, his tone courteous but firm. "We're fortunate to have benefited from her expertise temporarily." Felicity's expression revealed gratitude for his intervention, though something like disappointment flickered briefly in her eyes, as if she had hoped for a different response, one that might have challenged rather than confirmed the temporary nature of her presence. The moment passed as Henderson raised a question about the cattle shipping schedule, and conversation returned to business matters. Soon after, Felicity excused herself, citing the need to prepare documents for the following day's final negotiations. As she left the dining room, Quinn found his attention following her departure, an action not unnoticed by the perceptive Davidson. "Remarkable woman," the buyer commented after she had gone, swirling his bourbon. "Intelligence combined with practical capability is rare enough in men, rarer still in women." Quinn acknowledged the observation with a nod, unwilling to reveal his personal interest, yet unable to disagree with the assessment. "Her late husband must have been quite a man to have secured such a wife," Davidson continued, watching Quinn carefully over the rim of his glass. "Frontier widows of quality seldom remain unattached for long, particularly those with both beauty and useful skills." The implied question regarding Quinn's intentions was clear, despite the indirect phrasing. Quinn found himself at a crossroads. He could either maintain the fiction of a purely professional relationship with Felicity, closing the door on Davidson's speculation, or acknowledge the personal dimension that had developed between them, opening himself to further questioning he wasn't prepared to answer. "Mrs. O'Brien's worth is evident to anyone with discernment," he said finally, choosing a middle path. "Her future plans, however, are not a proper topic for business discussion." Davidson smiled slightly, accepting the rebuke with good humor. "Of course, forgive an old man's presumption. Now about those shipping arrangements." The conversation returned to cattle prices and transportation logistics, but Quinn's thoughts remained divided. Davidson's comments had forced him to confront directly what had been evolving gradually over the past week: his growing attachment to Felicity and the approaching decision point represented by her planned departure. For years, Quinn had operated on the principle that emotional entanglements were incompatible with frontier success, that a man must choose between building an empire and building a family. His own father's failure had seemed to confirm this belief, as domestic responsibilities had constantly diverted resources from business opportunities, creating a cycle of promise and disappointment that had ultimately destroyed both the man's dreams and his family's security. Yet Felicity challenged this fundamental assumption simply by existing, demonstrating that intelligence, practical capability, and feminine grace could coexist in a way that enhanced rather than diminished a man's enterprise. Her work with the accounts had improved his business operations. Her presence in his home had transformed it from mere shelter to something approaching a true haven. More significantly, her understanding of his achievement, recognizing it as a calling rather than merely a business success, had altered his own perception of what he had built and why it mattered. Through her eyes, he had begun to see his ranch not just as a personal empire, but as the foundation for a community, a legacy that would outlast him only if it served purposes beyond wealth accumulation. These realizations created a decision point as significant as any business crossroads he had faced. If Quinn continued on his established path, Felicity would depart for Montana in less than a week, leaving him to the solitary success he had always believed was his only option. If he chose a different trail, acknowledging the growing connection between them and acting upon it, he would be venturing into territory more uncertain than any wilderness he had yet faced. The landscape of emotional vulnerability where control and certainty gave way to risk and possibility. The weight of this impending choice accompanied Quinn throughout the remainder of the evening as business discussions concluded and the buyers retired to their rooms. Standing alone in his study after the house had quieted, Quinn gazed out at the ranch yard silvered by moonlight, the empire he had built spread before him in silent testimony to his determination and vision. For the first time since establishing Keller Ranch, the sight brought not satisfaction but a questioning of what purpose this achievement served if experienced in isolation, what meaning success held without someone who understood both its cost and its value, what legacy would endure if there were no one to carry forward not just the property but the philosophy that had shaped its development. As Quinn finally retired, these questions remained unanswered, though the direction of his thinking had begun to crystallize around a truth he had long denied: that true wealth might lie not in independence but in connection, not in self-reliance but in shared purpose, not in isolation but in the courage to risk heartbreak for the possibility of joy. The final day of negotiations began early, with Quinn and the Chicago buyers gathered in the office reviewing the details of their agreement. Felicity provided the necessary documentation, her quiet efficiency earning continued appreciation from Davidson and his colleagues. By mid-morning, the deal was concluded, 3,000 head of cattle sold at $32 each, a price slightly below Quinn's initial asking but well above the previous year's market. The most successful transaction in our business relationship to date, Davidson declared as contracts were signed and hands shaken. Your operation continues to impress, Keller. I anticipate even greater things next spring. Quinn accepted the compliment with a modest nod. We aim for continuous improvement, not just in numbers but in quality. Next year's herd will show the results of our breeding program even more clearly. As the buyers prepared to depart for town, where they would arrange shipping details with the railroad agent, Davidson drew Quinn aside for a private word. Speaking not as a buyer but as a man who's seen much of life, he said, his usual commercial manner giving way to genuine sincerity, opportunities for true partnership are rare on the frontier. When they appear, a wise man recognizes their value beyond mere business considerations. Though no names were mentioned, the reference to Felicity was unmistakable. Quinn met the older man's gaze directly. Your observation is noted, Davidson. Good, Davidson clapped him on the shoulder. I look forward to next year's sale and perhaps to meeting Mrs. Keller at that time. The presumption might have provoked irritation under other circumstances, but Quinn found himself unable to summon proper indignation. Instead, the suggestion created an image that lingered as he watched the buyer's wagon depart for town, Felicity as mistress of Keller Ranch, partner in both life and enterprise, transforming his achievement from personal empire to shared legacy. The possibility both attracted and terrified him, representing a fundamental shift in the philosophy that had guided his life since watching his father's failures. For years, Quinn had believed that frontier success required emotional isolation, that attachments were liabilities rather than assets in the harsh calculus of territorial enterprise. Felicity's presence had challenged that belief, suggesting that the right partnership might strengthen rather than weaken his position, enhancing rather than diminishing what he had built. Yet practical obstacles remained. Felicity had given no clear indication that her feelings matched his growing attachment. Her plans for Montana stood unchanged, her future apparently settled in her own mind. Any declaration on his part would require her to abandon those plans for an uncertain alternative based on a connection of barely 2 weeks' duration. These considerations occupied Quinn as he returned to the house, seeking Felicity to inform her of the successful conclusion of the sale. He found her in the garden with Mrs. Larson, helping to plant the spring vegetables despite her formal dress, her sleeves rolled up and a smudge of dirt on one cheek. The sight stopped him momentarily, this capable woman equally at ease with financial ledgers and practical gardening, bringing grace to both activities. Something tightened in Quinn's chest as he watched her laugh at something Mrs. Larson said, her face animated with genuine pleasure in the simple task. Mrs. O'Brien, he called, approaching the garden fence, the deal is concluded. 3,000 head at $32 each. Felicity straightened, brushing soil from her hands. Excellent news, Mr. Keller. That's $96,000, a significant return on your investment. The return to formal address in the presence of Mrs. Larson created a distance that Quinn found suddenly intolerable. The successful sale, normally cause for satisfaction, seemed hollow without someone who truly understood its significance sharing in the achievement. Would you ride with me this afternoon? He asked impulsively. There's a place I'd like to show you to celebrate the successful conclusion of the sale. Surprise flickered across Felicity's features, followed by evident pleasure. I would enjoy that very much, she replied. What time shall I be ready? 1 o'clock, Quinn said. We'll take a picnic lunch. As he turned to inform the kitchen of his plans, Quinn caught Mrs. Larson's knowing expression, the housekeeper clearly drawing conclusions about the nature of the proposed excursion. For once, Quinn found himself unconcerned about such perceptions. The coming ride represented more than a casual outing. It would be the setting for a conversation that might alter both their futures. The decision had crystallized during his observation of Felicity in the garden, not through deliberate calculation, but through the simple recognition that her departure would leave a void no business success could fill. In less than 2 weeks, she had transformed his perception of his ranch, his achievement, and ultimately his own life's purpose. Whether she would consider remaining was a question that could only be answered through direct conversation, a prospect that created equal measures of anticipation and anxiety as Quinn prepared for their afternoon ride. Felicity changed into her riding clothes with unusual care, her thoughts on Quinn's unexpected invitation. The formal completion of the cattle sale marked the effective conclusion of her work at the ranch. Her debt had been more than discharged through her reorganization of the accounts. Under normal circumstances, preparations for her departure would now begin, with transportation arranged to rejoin the wagon train at its next scheduled stop. Instead, Quinn had proposed a celebration ride, an activity that served no practical purpose but suggested a desire for her company beyond professional necessity. The implication both thrilled and unsettled her, raising possibilities she had been reluctant to fully acknowledge. Over the past 10 days, her feelings for Quinn had evolved from respectful admiration to something far deeper, a connection based on mutual understanding, shared values, and growing emotional attachment. Yet neither of them had spoken directly about these developing feelings or their potential implications for her plans. As Felicity braided her hair in a coronet that would fit neatly under her riding hat, she confronted the reality that today's excursion might force the very conversation they had both been avoiding. If Quinn's invitation signaled personal interest beyond their working relationship, she would need to decide whether that possibility justified reconsidering her plans for Montana. The prospect was simultaneously exhilarating and terrifying. Building a new life with her cousin offered security and independence without emotional risk. Remaining in Wyoming, if that was indeed what Quinn might propose, would mean entrusting her future to feelings that had developed over days rather than years, exchanging certainty for possibility. "You're getting far ahead of yourself," she murmured to her reflection, adjusting the collar of her riding jacket. "He invited you for a celebratory ride, nothing more." Yet as she descended the stairs to meet Quinn in the front hall, Felicity couldn't dismiss the sense that this afternoon might represent a crossroads in her journey, a moment of decision that would determine far more than her geographic destination. Quinn awaited her by the door, dressed in clean riding clothes that somehow enhanced rather than diminished his rugged masculinity. His eyes warmed at the sight of her, a reaction that sent a flutter of awareness through Felicity despite her attempts at practicality. "You look lovely," he said simply. "Thunder is saddled and waiting." "Thank you," she replied, accepting both the compliment and the hand he offered to help her into her riding gloves. The brief contact sent a current between them, awareness that transcended the casual touch. Outside, two horses stood ready, Quinn's buckskin stallion and the gentle Thunder who had become Felicity's regular mount. Strapped behind Thunder's saddle was a canvas bag that presumably contained their picnic lunch. The sight confirmed the planned nature of this excursion, suggesting that Quinn had given particular thought to their destination and activities. They mounted and rode out from the ranch yard, taking a trail that led toward the western hills rather than the more familiar routes they had traveled on previous rides. Felicity found herself simultaneously relaxed in Quinn's company and acutely aware of an undercurrent of expectation that made ordinary conversation challenging. "Where are we going?" she asked as they left the immediate ranch buildings behind. "There's a valley about an hour's ride from here," Quinn replied. "It's one of the most beautiful spots on the ranch, particularly in spring when the wildflowers are blooming." The simple answer revealed little about his intentions, maintaining the pretense that this was merely a scenic excursion to celebrate the successful cattle sale. Yet something in his manner suggested deeper purpose, a contained energy that spoke of decisions reached and conversations anticipated. As they rode side by side along a well-maintained trail, Quinn pointed out features of the landscape, a hawk's nest high in a cottonwood, a distant herd of antelope grazing on a hillside, the first wildflowers emerging in protected hollows. The familiar ease between them had returned, allowing conversation to flow naturally despite the underlying awareness of unresolved questions. "The sale exceeded even my expectations," Quinn said as they followed a creek winding through a narrow canyon. "Davidson recognized the quality of our breeding program and the comprehensive nature of our operation. Much of that is due to your work with the accounts." "I merely organized what already existed," Felicity demurred. "The achievement is entirely yours, Quinn." He shook his head, slowing his horse to navigate a rocky section of trail. "You did far more than organize ledgers, Felicity. You helped me see my own operation more clearly, not just as a business venture but as a larger vision taking shape." He glanced at her, his expression unusually open. "Seeing the ranch through your eyes has changed my perception of what I've built and why it matters." The admission, offered without calculation or reserve, touched Felicity deeply. In her experience, men rarely acknowledged the influence of women on their thinking, particularly in business matters. Quinn's recognition of her contribution beyond mere clerical work suggested a respect that transcended conventional attitudes toward female capability. "I'm glad if my perspective has been helpful," she said, warmed by his words. "Your achievement deserves to be seen in its full dimension, not just as financial success but as the creation of something enduring in this wilderness." They emerged from the canyon into a broad valley nestled between protective hills. As Quinn had promised, wildflowers carpeted the meadow in a riot of color. Blue lupin, yellow balsam root, purple asters, and delicate white spring beauties creating a natural tapestry across the lush grass. A small stream meandered through the center of the valley, bordered by willows just coming into leaf. Beyond the immediate meadow, pine forests climbed the surrounding hills, their deep green contrasting with the pastel blossoms below. "Oh, Quinn," Felicity breathed, raining thunder to a halt to absorb the scene. "It's magnificent." Quinn watched her reaction with evident pleasure. "This is my favorite place on the entire ranch," he said quietly. "I discovered it my first spring here, before I had built anything substantial. Whenever I've faced difficult decisions or needed perspective, I've come to this valley." The revelation of something so personal, a private retreat shared now by choice, created an intimacy between them that transcended their previous connection. Felicity understood immediately the significance of being brought to this special place, though she dared not interpret it beyond the simple fact of inclusion in something Quinn valued. They dismounted near the stream, Quinn securing the horses where they could graze while he retrieved the picnic basket. Felicity helped him spread a blanket in a sheltered spot overlooking both the flower-filled meadow and the distant mountains, conscious of the domestic nature of their shared activity. The picnic proved to be simple but thoughtfully prepared. Cold chicken, fresh bread, cheese, early strawberries from the kitchen garden, and a bottle of white wine that Quinn had packed in a container of cold water to keep chilled. As they ate, conversation flowed easily between them, touching on the successful cattle sale, the spring planting at the ranch, and their mutual enjoyment of the valley's beauty. Yet beneath this pleasant exchange, Felicity sensed Quinn's contained energy, a man who had reached some internal decision point and was merely waiting for the right moment to speak. The awareness created both anticipation and anxiety, as she could not predict with certainty what thoughts might be occupying him beyond the obvious pleasure of their outing. When they had finished eating, Quinn gathered the remains of their picnic back into the basket, then turned to face Felicity directly. His expression had grown serious, his usual reserve giving way to a vulnerability she had glimpsed only in rare, unguarded moments. "Felicity," he began, her name soft on his lips, "there's something I need to say to you, something I've been considering since almost the moment you arrived at the ranch." Her heart quickened at his tone, hope and fear mingling in equal measure. "Yes, Quinn." He met her gaze directly, his blue-green eyes reflecting both determination and uncertainty. "When I offered you employment to settle your debt for wagon repairs, I was thinking only of practical matters. The accounts needed organizing, you had skills that could accomplish that task. It was a business arrangement, nothing more." Felicity nodded, uncertain where his statement was leading but acutely aware of its significance. "What I never anticipated," Quinn continued, "was how your presence would change everything, not just the ledgers but my perception of the ranch itself, of what I've built and why it matters." He gestured toward the valley spread before them. "For years, I've believed that frontier success required sacrifice of personal considerations, that a man must choose between building an empire and building a life of connection." He paused, seeming to gather courage for what came next. "You've shown me the falseness of that belief simply by existing, demonstrating that intelligence and capability can enhance rather than diminish what I've created." His voice softened. "More than that, you've made me recognize the hollowness at the center of my achievement, an empire built for a future without heirs, comfort without companionship, wealth without purpose beyond its own accumulation." The words touched Felicity profoundly, resonating with her own observations about the emptiness beneath Quinn's impressive success. Yet she remained silent, sensing he had more to say and unwilling to interrupt the most personal disclosure she had yet heard from him. "I know you have plans for Montana," Quinn continued, his tone revealing the difficulty of this conversation despite his determination to proceed. "I know your cousin offers security and independence without emotional complications. I know that considering any alternative based on such brief acquaintance might seem reckless." He took her hand then, the simple contact conveying earnestness beyond words. But I cannot let you leave without telling you what these days together have meant to me. How your presence has transformed my home from mere shelter to something approaching a true haven. How your understanding of my work has given it meaning beyond financial success. How the thought of your departure creates an emptiness no business achievement could fill. Felicity's breath caught at the naked honesty of his declaration. So different from the controlled businessman she had first encountered. Quinn, she began, but he gently stopped her with a raised hand. Please, let me finish before you respond. His expression revealed both vulnerability and determination, a man unaccustomed to emotional disclosure yet committed to complete honesty. I'm not asking for immediate answers or promises. I understand that your plans were made with careful consideration, that your future security is at stake, that my feelings may not match your own. He drew a deep breath, then continued with quiet intensity. All I ask is that you consider remaining in Wyoming, not as an employee, but as my partner in building something that would transcend what either of us could create alone. The ranch needs your intelligence and vision. The house needs your presence to become a true home. The community forming around us needs the contributions you could make. His voice softened further, becoming almost a whisper. And I need you, Felicity, not for practical assistance, but for the way you see the world, the way you understand what I've built, the way your presence makes everything I've accomplished finally mean something beyond mere possession. The declaration hung between them, profound in its simplicity and honesty. Felicity felt tears gathering in her eyes, moved beyond words by the courage it had taken for this proud, self-contained man to expose his deepest feelings and hopes. Quinn, she said finally, her voice unsteady with emotion, I don't know what to say, this is so unexpected. You don't need to answer now, he assured her, though hope and fear warred in his expression. I understand the magnitude of what I'm suggesting, the alteration of plans carefully made, the risk of entrusting your future to feelings that have developed over days rather than years. He released her hand, creating space for her to consider his words without pressure. All I ask is that you reflect on the possibility before proceeding with your journey to Montana, that you consider whether what we might build together could offer not just security but fulfillment, not just survival but true partnership. Felicity studied him, this remarkable man who had revealed his heart with such unflinching honesty. In her experience, men rarely acknowledged vulnerability or need, particularly those who had achieved significant success through their own efforts. Quinn's willingness to risk rejection, to expose his deepest feelings despite lifelong habits of self-reliance, moved her profoundly. More significant still was the nature of what he offered, not rescue or protection, but partnership in building something larger than either could create alone. Not dependence but mutual reliance, not possession but shared creation. I have felt it too, she admitted finally, her voice soft but steady. This connection between us that seems to transcend the brevity of our acquaintance, the sense that something significant would be left behind if I continued to Montana as planned. Hope kindled in Quinn's eyes, though he maintained his composure. Then you'll consider remaining. Yes, Felicity replied, the single word carrying the weight of potential futures reimagined. But there are practical considerations beyond feelings, Quinn. My cousin expects me. I have no independent means. Any decision would need to be made with clear understanding of what partnership would mean in practical terms, not just emotional ones. Quinn nodded, respect evident in his expression. Of course. I would expect nothing less from someone with your intelligence and foresight. He hesitated, then added with careful precision, if it helps clarify my intentions, I should state explicitly that I am proposing marriage, Felicity, a full legal partnership with all that entails. The direct statement brought both clarity and increased complexity. Marriage would provide security and social standing, but it would also bind her future irrevocably to Quinn's, to this ranch, to Wyoming Territory. The decision carried implications far beyond the immediate emotional connection between them. I need time to think, Felicity said finally. Not because I doubt my feelings for you, but because such a decision deserves careful consideration. My experience with widowhood has taught me the vulnerability of depending entirely on another person, however trustworthy. I understand, Quinn replied, disappointment mingling with respect in his tone. Take whatever time you need. The offer stands regardless of how long consideration requires. They sat in silence for several moments, the weight of unresolved futures hanging between them. Yet the silence was companionable rather than awkward, two people who had spoken truth to each other and now needed space to absorb its implications. Finally, Quinn rose and extended his hand to help Felicity to her feet. "We should head back before darkness makes the trail difficult." As they gathered their picnic things and prepared the horses for the return journey, Felicity found herself studying Quinn with new awareness. Not just as the successful rancher or even the increasingly familiar friend, but as a potential life partner. The prospect was simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating, a future different from anything she had imagined when joining the wagon train to Montana, yet somehow feeling more right than any plan she had made since James's death. The ride back to the ranch unfolded in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts yet conscious of the significant shift their conversation had created. The familiar buildings came into view as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the landscape in gold and casting long shadows across the ranch yard. As Quinn helped her dismount at the stables, his hands lingering briefly at her waist, Felicity made a decision. Not about his proposal, which still required careful consideration, but about the immediate moment. "Thank you for sharing your special place with me today," she said softly, holding his gaze, "and for trusting me with your thoughts and feelings. Whatever decision I make about the future, I will always remember this day as a gift." Then, setting aside the conventional restraint of widowhood and proper distance, Felicity rose on tiptoe and placed a gentle kiss on his cheek, a simple gesture that nonetheless conveyed both gratitude and possibility. Quinn's expression transformed, surprise giving way to a joy that illuminated his features more completely than she had yet witnessed. For a moment they stood thus, connected by touch and gaze and unspoken potential, before Felicity stepped back to a proper distance. "Good evening, Quinn," she said, a smile warming her words. "I'll see you at dinner." As she walked toward the house, Felicity was conscious of Quinn's gaze following her progress, awareness of their shared secret creating a warmth that had nothing to do with the evening sunlight. The future remained undecided, questions of practical partnership still requiring resolution. But in this moment, possibility seemed more concrete than any plan she had previously made. A potential life taking shape not through careful calculation, but through the unexpected connection of kindred spirits in the vast wilderness of Wyoming Territory. The days following Quinn's proposal unfolded in a curious mixture of normalcy and heightened awareness. Outwardly little changed in their routine. Felicity continued organizing the remaining accounts, Quinn attended to ranch operations, and they shared meals and evening conversations as before. Yet beneath this surface calm, both were acutely conscious of the unresolved question between them, the potential future that awaited Felicity's decision. For Quinn, the waiting period tested every instinct for control and decisive action that had built his success. Having opened himself to vulnerability by expressing his feelings, he now faced the unfamiliar challenge of patience, allowing Felicity the time and space needed for proper consideration without pressuring her toward his desired outcome. Each morning as he rode out to supervise ranch operations, Quinn found his thoughts returning to the flower-filled valley and their conversation there. The careful honesty with which he had offered partnership, the thoughtful attention with which Felicity had received his proposal, the gentle kiss that had suggested possibility without promising certainty. The memory sustained hope while demanding restraint, creating a tension unlike any business negotiation he had previously navigated. At dinner 3 evenings after their ride, Felicity broached a practical question that revealed the careful consideration she was giving his offer. "If I were to remain in Wyoming," she began, her tone deliberately neutral, "what role would you envision for me in the ranch operations beyond the traditional duties of a wife?" Quinn recognized immediately the significance of her inquiry, not just personal partnership but professional involvement in the enterprise he had built. "I would welcome your continued work with the accounts," he replied, giving her question the serious attention it deserved. "But beyond that, I believe your banking background and financial acumen could be valuable in our expansion plans and investment decisions." Felicity nodded, apparently satisfied with his answer, but clearly having more to ask. "And in the community, you mentioned plans for married workers' housing, perhaps a school. Would you object to my involvement in establishing those social improvements?" "Object, I would welcome it," Quinn said with genuine enthusiasm. "My expertise lies in cattle and land management. Building community requires different skills, understanding family needs, creating social connections, establishing educational standards. Your contribution would be essential, not incidental." The conversation continued in this vein throughout dinner and into the evening, Felicity asking thoughtful questions about everything from legal ownership arrangements to plans for future expansion, from daily operational decisions to long-term legacy considerations. Quinn answered each inquiry honestly and completely, recognizing that for Felicity, marriage represented not just emotional partnership but practical alliance in building something that would endure beyond their lifetimes. As days passed, Quinn found himself appreciating anew the remarkable woman before him. Her intelligence in considering all dimensions of partnership, her courage in contemplating such a significant change to her carefully laid plans, her honesty in acknowledging both the attraction between them and the practical considerations that transcended mere feeling. In these conversations, Felicity revealed more of her own thinking as well, her desire for meaningful work beyond domestic responsibilities, her vision for what the ranch community might become with proper development, her reluctance to enter another marriage where traditional female limitations might stifle her capabilities. Quinn listened with equal care, recognizing that the partnership he sought would require adjustments to his own assumptions about marriage and a wife's role. On the fifth evening after his proposal, as they sat in the office reviewing plans for the new married workers' housing, Felicity closed the ledger she had been consulting and turned to face Quinn directly. "I've been considering your proposal with great care," she said, her expression serious yet warm. "Examining not just my feelings for you, which have grown stronger with each passing day, but the practical implications of building a life together here rather than continuing to Montana as planned." Quinn set aside the building sketches, giving her his complete attention. His heart raced despite his outward calm, recognizing that her decision had been reached. "Clara's offer provided security without risk," Felicity continued, her gray eyes steady on his. "A modest position in an established business, independence without emotional complications, a future I could predict with reasonable certainty." She paused and Quinn maintained his silence, allowing her to express her thoughts completely. "What you offer is simultaneously more uncertain and more promising, partnership in building something that might transcend what either of us could create alone. A shared vision rather than mere security, potential beyond anything I had imagined when planning my journey to Montana." Quinn's hope grew as she spoke, though he remained aware that she had not yet stated her conclusion directly. "The practical woman in me recognizes the risk in changing course based on such brief acquaintance," Felicity acknowledged. 2 weeks is hardly sufficient time to know someone completely, particularly when considering a lifetime commitment. She reached across the desk then, taking his hand in a gesture that melted some of the tension building in his chest. "But my heart recognizes something my practical mind cannot fully explain, a connection that seems to transcend time, an understanding that feels both new and familiar, as if we have been walking separate paths toward a meeting that was somehow always intended." Her fingers tightened slightly around his. "I believe in the partnership you've proposed, Quinn, not just as husband and wife in the traditional sense, but as true allies in building something meaningful in this wilderness. If your offer still stands, I choose to remain in Wyoming rather than continuing to Montana. I choose the uncertainty of our shared vision over the security of solitary independence." Joy surged through Quinn, pure and powerful. "The offer stands, Felicity. It will always stand." She smiled then, the expression transforming her features from beautiful to radiant. "Then my answer is yes. Yes to marriage, yes to partnership, yes to building something together that neither of us could create alone." Quinn found himself momentarily unable to speak, emotion overwhelming his usual articulate control. Instead, he rose and moved around the desk, drawing Felicity to her feet and into his arms for the first time, a gesture that felt simultaneously new and familiar, like coming home to a place he had always belonged. "Thank you," he whispered against her hair, "for seeing possibility where I once saw only isolation, for recognizing partnership where I thought only independence could survive." Felicity leaned back slightly to meet his gaze, her own eyes bright with unshed tears of joy. "Thank you for offering more than mere security, for seeing me as capable of contribution beyond traditional expectations, for valuing my mind as well as my heart." The moment stretched between them, charged with awareness and possibility. Then with gentle deliberation, Quinn lowered his lips to hers in their first kiss, tender at first, then deepening as Felicity responded with equal feeling. The connection transcended physical attraction, though that was certainly present. It represented the sealing of a covenant between them, a promise of partnership that would transform both their lives and the legacy they would build together. When they finally parted, Quinn kept Felicity within the circle of his arms, unwilling to release this tangible evidence of their new reality. When, he asked simply, understanding his meaning immediately, Felicity considered the question with characteristic thoughtfulness. "Soon," she replied. "There's no reason for extended delay, perhaps 2 weeks. Enough time to make proper arrangements, but not so long as to seem like hesitation." Quinn nodded, pleased by both her decisiveness and her practical approach. 2 weeks, he agreed. That will allow time to prepare the house, arrange for the minister from town, and send word to Elizabeth. She would never forgive me if she weren't invited to the wedding, though whether she can travel from Boston in time is another matter. Practical details occupied their conversation for the remainder of the evening. Decisions about the ceremony's location, guests to invite, arrangements to be made. Yet beneath these necessary plans lay a deeper current of joy, the shared recognition that they had chosen a future neither had anticipated when their paths first crossed, yet one that now seemed both inevitable and right. As they finally parted for the night, Quinn lifted Felicity's hand to his lips in a gesture both courtly and intimate. "Sleep well, future Mrs. Keller," he said softly. "And you, future husband," she replied, her smile containing both present happiness and the promise of shared tomorrows stretching beyond what either could currently imagine. Quinn watched her ascend the stairs before returning to his study, his mind and heart full of plans and possibilities that had seemed impossible just weeks earlier. The ranch house that had always been merely headquarters now held the promise of becoming a true home. The empire he had built for unknown future beneficiaries now had purpose beyond mere accumulation. The solitude he had believed was the necessary price of frontier success had given way to partnership more valuable than any cattle herd or land holding. As he stood at the window overlooking his domain silvered by moonlight, Quinn recognized that the true wealth of his achievement lay not in acres owned or cattle numbered, but in the shared vision taking shape between himself and the remarkable woman who had agreed to walk beside him in building a legacy neither could create alone. Word of the impending marriage spread quickly through the ranch and surrounding territory. Cowboys and townspeople alike expressed varying degrees of surprise and approval at the news that the reputedly confirmed bachelor Quinn Keller would wed the beautiful widow who had so recently arrived in their midst. Mrs. Larson, particularly pleased by the development, threw herself into preparations with enthusiastic efficiency, directing the thorough cleaning of the ranch house and planning a wedding feast worthy of the occasion. For Felicity, the days following her acceptance of Quinn's proposal unfolded in a whirlwind of activity and emotion. Letters were dispatched, one to Clara in Montana explaining her change in plans, another to her mother in Pennsylvania sharing news of her unexpected happiness. Quinn insisted on ordering a proper wedding dress from the finest shop in Cheyenne, dispatching a ranch hand with Felicity's measurements and instructions to spare no expense. Throughout these preparations, the connection between Felicity and Quinn deepened through both practical partnership and growing emotional intimacy. Their conversations expanded beyond ranch operations to personal histories, future hopes, and the shared values that would guide their life together. Each revelation, each moment of vulnerability, confirmed for Felicity the rightness of her decision despite its apparent impulsiveness by conventional standards. 1 week before the wedding, as they reviewed plans for expanding the kitchen garden to include flowers as well as vegetables, Quinn presented Felicity with a small velvet box. "I meant to give you this sooner," he said, an uncharacteristic nervousness in his manner. "It arrived from Cheyenne yesterday." Inside the box lay an engagement ring of unusual beauty, a central diamond flanked by 2 sapphires set in intricately worked gold. Felicity gasped at its elegance, recognizing immediately that this was no hastily purchased token, but a carefully selected symbol of their commitment. "It's beautiful, Quinn," she said as he slipped it onto her finger, a perfect fit. "But how did you manage to find something so perfect without my knowledge?" A smile touched his lips. "I may have consulted Mrs. Larson about your preferences. She's quite observant about such things." The ring's weight felt both unfamiliar and right, a tangible reminder of the future they had chosen together. Felicity found herself glancing at it throughout the day, still adjusting to the reality that she would soon be Quinn Keller's wife, mistress of this substantial ranch, partner in building a legacy neither had anticipated when their paths first crossed. That evening, a wagon arrived from town bearing an unexpected gift, a fine piano delivered to the ranch house at Quinn's request. Felicity had mentioned in passing her childhood musical training, a pleasure abandoned during the practical demands of frontier farming. The instrument, positioned in the previously underutilized formal parlor, represented Quinn's desire to restore dimensions of life that hardship had forced her to set aside. "Music should be part of a true home," he said simply as Felicity ran her fingers reverently over the polished keys. "This house has lacked it for too long." The gesture moved Felicity profoundly, not just for the generosity it represented, but for the understanding of her as a complete person with needs beyond practical survival. In her marriage to James, necessity had dictated the setting aside of such luxuries as music, literature, and intellectual pursuits. Quinn's gift acknowledged that a full life required nourishment of spirit as well as body, beauty as well as function. As the wedding day approached, final preparations accelerated. The ranch house underwent transformation, fresh paint in selected rooms, new curtains in the master bedroom, flowers arranged in vases throughout the public spaces. Quinn himself supervised the expansion of the veranda that would host the ceremony, ensuring that every detail met his exacting standards. 3 days before the wedding, a telegram arrived from Quinn's sister Elizabeth. Unable to travel from Boston in time for the ceremony, she expressed both congratulations and a promise to visit during the summer to meet her new sister-in-law. Though disappointment flickered briefly in Quinn's eyes at the news, he accepted it with characteristic practicality. "We'll have a celebration when she visits," he assured Felicity. "A proper opportunity for you to know each other beyond the chaos of a wedding day." The morning of the wedding dawned clear and warm, perfect spring weather that seemed to bless their union. Felicity woke early in what would be her last day in the guest bedroom, a curious mixture of excitement and solemnity filling her thoughts. Marriage to Quinn represented not just personal happiness but significant responsibility, partnership in an enterprise that supported dozens of families, stewardship of land that would outlast their lifetimes, the potential beginning of a family that would carry their shared values into future generations. As she prepared for the day, assisted by Mrs. Larson and the young wife of a ranch hand who had volunteered to help with her toilette, Felicity found herself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. Widowhood had seemed an ending, forcing her toward a future of diminished expectations and practical compromise. Instead, it had become a passage to unexpected renewal, a second chance at building a life of purpose and connection in this harsh but beautiful territory. The wedding dress from Cheyenne proved to be everything Quinn had promised: ivory silk with delicate lace trim, modest yet elegant, perfectly suited to a second marriage while acknowledging the significance of the occasion. With her honey blonde hair arranged in an intricate coil, adorned with small white flowers from the garden, and a simple pearl pendant that had belonged to her mother as her only jewelry besides the engagement ring, Felicity presented a vision of grace and quiet joy as she prepared to join Quinn on the veranda. Outside, nearly 100 guests had gathered, ranch hands and their families, neighboring ranchers, townspeople who did business with Keller Ranch, even a few members of the wagon train that had continued to Montana but sent representatives back for the celebration. The assembly represented the community forming around Quinn's enterprise, the social connections that would transform individual homesteads into a cohesive settlement over time. Quinn awaited her at the far end of the veranda, the territorial judge who would perform the ceremony beside him. In his best black suit with a new white shirt and silver brocade waistcoat, he presented a striking figure, the successful rancher transformed into bridegroom, his usual reserve giving way to evident joy as Felicity appeared in the doorway. Their eyes met across the gathered assembly, and in that moment, Felicity knew with complete certainty that her decision had been right despite its apparent impulsiveness. The connection between them transcended conventional understanding, a recognition of kindred spirits meeting against the odds in this vast wilderness, finding in each other the perfect complement to their individual strengths and visions. The ceremony itself was brief but meaningful, the traditional vows spoken with genuine commitment by both bride and groom. When the judge pronounced them husband and wife, Quinn's kiss was both tender and possessive, a promise of partnership that encompassed every dimension of their shared future. The celebration that followed reflected the dual nature of their union, part traditional frontier wedding with abundant food, music, and dancing, part business alliance marking the expansion of Keller Ranch into a true community center. Throughout the festivities, Quinn kept Felicity close, his hand often finding hers as if to reassure himself of the reality of their new status. As the afternoon stretched into evening, guests gradually departed until only the ranch household remained. In the quieting house, Quinn led Felicity to the veranda where they had exchanged vows hours earlier, the setting sun painting the landscape in gold and rose. "Are you happy, Mrs. Keller?" he asked softly, his arm around her waist as they gazed across the empire they would now share. "Deeply happy," Felicity confirmed, leaning into his embrace, "though I'm still adjusting to the name. It will take time to think of myself as Felicity Keller rather than O'Brien." "We have all the time in the world," Quinn assured her, pressing a kiss to her temple. "A lifetime to build something neither of us could create alone." As darkness fell and stars appeared above the Wyoming landscape, Quinn and Felicity retired to the master bedroom now prepared for both of them. The room transformed from bachelor quarters to marriage chamber through Felicity's careful attention to comfort and beauty. There, in the privacy of their new shared space, they consummated their union with tenderness that deepened to passion, discovering physical harmony that matched their intellectual and emotional connection. Later, as Felicity lay in Quinn's arms, the connection between them transcending mere physical satisfaction, she recognized the true miracle of their union, not just the finding of personal happiness after loss, but the creation of partnership that would transform both their lives and the legacy they would build together in this untamed territory. "Thank you," she whispered against Quinn's chest, feeling his heartbeat strong beneath her cheek. "For what?" he murmured, his fingers tracing patterns along her bare shoulder. "For seeing me as capable of more than mere survival," Felicity replied. "For offering partnership rather than protection, shared vision rather than simple security." Quinn tightened his arms around her, emotion evident in the gesture. "Thank you for challenging my belief that frontier success required isolation, for showing me that the right partnership strengthens rather than diminishes what I've built." In the darkness of their wedding night, surrounded by the vast Wyoming wilderness yet secure in their connection, Quinn and Felicity sealed a covenant beyond traditional marriage, a promise to build something enduring together, to transform personal achievement into shared legacy. To create in this harsh frontier a home defined not just by walls and roof, but by mutual purpose and abiding love. As they drifted toward sleep, still entangled in each other's arms, both recognized the journey ahead would contain challenges alongside joys, difficulties as well as triumphs. Yet they faced that future with the unshakable certainty that they would meet it together. The solitude that had once defined Quinn's life had been banished, replaced by a partnership that made every burden lighter and every joy more profound. In the silence of the room, he tightened his hold on his wife, and Felicity sighed in content, no longer a traveler passing through, but a woman who had finally, truly arrived. 5 years later, the summer sun bathed the Keller ranch in a golden light that seemed to promise an eternity of abundance. The operation had expanded as Quinn had predicted, but the changes to the land were not merely measured in acreage or cattle head counts. To the west of the main house, a sturdy white building with a bell tower stood as the center of a thriving community. The schoolhouse Felicity had envisioned, attended now by the children of the married ranch hands who lived in the neat row of cottages nearby. The sound of children's laughter had become as much a part of the ranch's rhythm as the lowing of cattle or the wind in the cottonwoods. On the wide veranda of the main house, Quinn sat in a rocking chair, a ledger open on his lap but his attention fixed on the yard. He looked older, the gray at his temples more pronounced, but the lines of tension that had once defined his face had smoothed into an expression of deep contentment. Uncle Quinn. "Watch this." A 6-year-old boy with bright red hair, the son of Quinn's sister Elizabeth, who was visiting from Boston for the second time that year, raced across the lawn, pursued by a toddling girl with honey-blonde curls and determined gray eyes. "I see you, Thomas," Quinn called out, smiling as his own daughter, Catherine, abandoned the chase to scramble up the porch steps. She launched herself at him, and he caught her easily, settling her on his knee. "And where is your mother, little bird?" "Right here," Felicity said, stepping through the French doors with a tray of lemonade. She wore a dress of pale yellow that caught the sunlight, her face glowing with health and happiness. She set the tray on the table and moved to stand behind Quinn's chair, resting her hand on his shoulder in a gesture of easy intimacy that still, after 5 years, had the power to ground him instantly. "Elizabeth is resting," she reported softly. "She says the Wyoming air is invigorating, but chasing Thomas is exhausting regardless of the geography." Quinn chuckled, covering her hand with his own. "She loves it here, though. She told me yesterday she's trying to convince her husband to open a branch of his bank in Cheyenne, so they can stay permanently. I know, Felicity smiled. I may have been encouraging her. She looked out over the valley, at the schoolhouse, the thriving gardens, the busy corrals, and the distant mountains that held their special valley in their embrace. It was a kingdom, yes, but it was no longer ruled in solitude. It was a community, a legacy, a home. Do you remember, Quinn asked, his voice low as he looked up at her, when you thought you were just passing through? I remember, Felicity murmured, her fingers brushing the hair at his nape. I remember feeling like a leaf blown by the wind, with no place to land. And now, she looked down at him, at the husband who had become her best friend, her partner, her heart. She looked at their daughter, secure and loved in her father's arms. She thought of the accounts she had balanced that morning, the school board meeting she would lead the next day, the life that was so full it seemed impossible she had ever felt empty. Now, she whispered, leaning down to kiss him, I know that I was never really lost, Quinn. I was just making my way to you. Quinn pulled her closer, surrounding himself with his family, the true wealth he had waited a lifetime to find. Welcome home, he said, echoing the words he had spoken on their wedding night, words that were no longer a promise, but a beautiful, enduring reality.